Welcome to the Anomalous Review, the official podcast of the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. My name is Michael Glosson. I'm a philosopher of science and technology and the host of the show. This conversation is part of a special series on the Anomalous Review that we're calling the UAP Witness series. Let me tell you a bit about it. In this series, I interview SCU members who've had their own personal encounters with truly anomalous phenomena. These conversations are a new format for us. As an organization, SCU leans toward a hard science approach to studying UAP. That means using quantitative data that fits into spreadsheets and that can be analyzed with consistent statistical methods. Things like the size, shape, acoustical, and kinetic properties of UAP. That's the kind of data that SCU specializes in. Now, that's partly because of our skill set. Most of our members are working scientists and engineers. So we're used to using that kind of data and those sorts of analytical tools. But this approach also serves as a kind of hedge that keeps sober discussions about UAP from falling into unstructured or even unreasonable speculation. You probably know the kind of conversations that I mean. We like structured investigations that employ the tools that we're familiar with. But it would be a mistake to think that we at SCU focus on the hard data points simply because we think that that's all there is to these phenomena. Every one of those data points, after all, comes from an encounter that was deeply and uniquely personal. And these encounters are far richer, stranger, and more complex than the numbers in a spreadsheet might ever suggest. The tools of quantitative analysis just aren't great for analyzing those unique experiential dimensions, though. So, for our analytic work at SCU, we usually just set the rich elements of those stories aside. But shortly after we launched this podcast, SCU leaders told me that there are several SCU members who'd had their own encounters with UAP. And after a few conversations, we decided, let's invite those members to tell their stories, just as they experienced them, along with all the questions and ideas that those encounters gave rise to. Encounters like these are, after all, the source of our hard data points. And inviting people to tell their stories here is a way of showing what's on the other side of the spreadsheets, the unique, complex, deeply strange, and often unsettling experiences that push us to ask questions that data-driven analytical methods aren't always fit to tackle. So let me say this clearly, though. Acknowledging the strangeness of these encounters, giving people space to tell them just as they live them, is in no way a departure from SCU's data-driven scientific mission. But it's meant to complement that mission by acknowledging the very elements of our source material that often compelled us to want to do the scientific work in the first place. This is an expression of the conviction that doing good science means holding on to intellectual humility before a reality that's under no obligations to conform to our expectations or to our tools. And that means facing reality as it comes, even and especially when it challenges our frameworks. We're putting out two versions of each interview in this series. One is a long, unedited version that contains the whole conversation. The other is a shorter version where the guest just gives a basic overview of some of the details of their encounter. This recording is a full-length conversation. In it, we go into significant depth, not just about the guest's encounter, but about how that experience affected them personally, and how they processed the experience both intellectually and spiritually. These aren't quick stories. They're stories people have lived often for decades. We wanted to create a space where they could be told in full without interruption or oversimplification, and that's what this long version is meant to provide. Mick Gold is a media and information technologist based in Baltimore, Maryland. He's worked with major broadcasters, studios, government agencies, and biotech startups. He's been a contributing member of the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies and Harvard University's Galileo project, and he's the founder of Declassify UAP, an organization that's helped U.S. voters advocate for government transparency around the UAP subject and that has so far driven over 25,000 calls and letters to Washington, D.C. You can find out more about that work or voice your own support for UAP transparency at declassifyuap.org. Nick is a stunningly smart thinker. In our conversations, weave together his interests in philosophy, the nature of mind, synchronicity, and the political dimensions of the UAP phenomena. That was a treat for me because those are all subjects that I also want to bring into the general discourse around UAP, so we really get to stretch our legs in these conversations. I hope you enjoy that. Remember, there are two different versions of each of these UAP Witness interviews. There's a condensed conversation that just covers some details of the encounter, and there's a full-length deep dive conversation that goes into all of the details and where I ask lots of questions. This is the full-length version. Here now is my conversation with Nick Gold. Hi, Nick.
Hey, how's it going, Michael?
Doing well. How are you, man?
Oh, you know.
Do I? You can let it out. Tell me.
Oh, gosh. Well, going way back, might as well start at the beginning of the adventure, right? I've been into UFOs thoroughly for coming up on 4 decades now. I got the bug in elementary school in the 1980s. I'm just going to plant the flag on the day that I saw Flight of the Navigator in the theater at my friend's, I think, 8th birthday party. You Are the Navigator always sort of felt like a call to action for me. So,
what a fantastic film, yeah.
And it holds up really well. I rewatch it once in a blue moon, and even down to radar displays showing UFOs dropping from high atmospheric levels, akin to the 2004 Nimitz incident. Just a lot of really interesting subtle things, but that was sort of like eyes wide open. I think I had certainly heard of the topic at that point, but there was just something so visceral about it. And I began doing research, even reading books as a kid, and very quickly, it struck me that there was absolutely a there.
Sure.
It didn't take much of a breakthrough. I mean, like all of us who are interested in this topic for decades at a time, you have your various journey that you go on as far as your understanding goes, or your own experiences, which I'm sure we'll talk about today. But, it just seemed utterly credible. I was doing reports in college as an undergrad on like old government UFO studies, like, Project Sign and Grudge and Blue Book and all that. So, I was pretty attuned to it. There was a lot going on in UFO world in the 90s, I'm kind of coming of age, high school, college. Obviously Greer and the Disclosure Project, but also things like the Cometa Report were coming out, and just so much interesting activity around the topic, which obviously kind of served to just keep me quite interested. There was obviously not much going on for a few decades, frankly.
Yeah.
And in that time, I graduated college in 2000, went on to have a very interesting professional career. You've taken a little bit of a sabbatical from that, if you will. But
what did you do?
So I've always been around not just technology, but the intersection of media and technology. I was in the computer music program at college, learning how computers and desktop systems are used for audio production and recording and all that stuff. Also was really into video. And, when I was in college, it was sort of like the transition from linear editing with video cassette decks to nonlinear editing using Avids and computers was just kind of underway. And so kind of straddled that. And then so, for a few years out of college, I had a few different gigs, some were tech and media related, but then I fell into working for a Baltimore-based, what we call a systems integrator, kind of an IT firm that builds whole solutions using a variety of components and vendors, products and stuff. And I was with them for 15 years. And this was a small firm in Baltimore, and we worked and did data storage solutions, data management solutions, workflow automation platforms, archive systems, you name it, for pretty much any type of organization you can possibly imagine that uses information technology to both capture, store, manipulate, distribute, archive media content, specifically a lot of video stuff.
This is just like back-end B2B plugging systems in with other systems and
Mostly, and a lot of the times, our unofficial motto that I think I coined at one point was "from lens to screen and everything in between." Because the reality is, the current media technology environment is a set of interconnected IT systems, from the lens now, and then obviously the camera, all the way out to how people view this content, which is radically different when I began working with them, in around 2004 timeframe. So I think it was 2004, 2004, 2005. So yeah, it was 2004, actually. Sorry. So, I was with them during a lot of evolutions of the technology space around media. That included going from standard def to high definition, and having to build out a lot of facilities that were doing that. And that, for many of them, included kind of taking them more to the IT-centric way of working with rich media. But being based in Baltimore, and that's where the company had been traditionally centered in this region, the company was dealing with a lot of creative technologists that were doing desktop publishing, print, pre-press, a lot of Mac-centric environments. And then Apple kind of got into the video space with Final Cut in a more serious way and started kind of building out their own technology ecosystem. We ended up graduating well beyond the Apple offerings. But we were building out CNN's Washington, D.C. facility, and the editing and data storage and even video ingest and playout capabilities. You might remember Wolf Blitzer had this show back in the day where there was all these screens behind him showing. Yes. We put in the system that they were using to drive the video to those. So, I was working with a lot of interesting major broadcast type operations and such. We got into the DC market. We eventually ended up doing a lot in New York City with major firms, broadcasters, sports teams, corporations. One of the absolute, undisputedly largest musical and pop stars on the planet, and helping her organization out. So many very interesting types of opportunities. Interestingly, being based in Baltimore and being kind of so close to the DC market, we had always done a little bit of government business even before I joined the company in 2004. But through our relationship with Apple and then some other vendors, we ended up getting pulled into, because of our expertise, our hands-on, actually designing platforms and complex solutions and deploying them and supporting them and all of it. We got pulled into some very interesting types of accounts, government agencies, ones that are often associated with a certain topic that we're here to discuss today, some of the big contractors around them, but then everything else that just kind of goes along in the sort of DC ecosystem, the Beltway ecosystem, major nonprofits, PACs, think tanks, basically, everything that exists around DC and policy and all of this stuff, presidential campaigns, all sorts of folks, frankly, across all the spectrums. And, I am who I am, and I have my own personal way of living this life. But I, always was generally able to work with a variety of types of clients. And it really opened my eyes. I was trusted by them. I did the best work for everyone I worked with, whether it was mom and pops or major corporations, left, right, in between. Gave them all the same professionalism. But it really opened my eyes, working with the agencies, the think tanks, just everything in that realm, and giving me like a real visceral first-person experience. None of that touched on UFOs in any way, shape, or form in my direct experience. However, I did get to know people who work for the intelligence community or work for the IC under a major contractor, because a lot of those big legacy contractors place a lot of heads into agencies. People don't realize this. The government has been largely privatized over the last 30, 40 years. And so half the people in the DOD or the IC are wearing what we call the green badge versus the blue badge, which means they're a contractor officially, even if they have a very specific role working for DOD or the intelligence community. So I was one of those people for a little while. Again, had no need to know, frankly, about anything. We were putting in IT systems and not even knowing the first thing about the content that was on these systems, other than very general descriptions, doing the same kind of stuff I did with every client. But it gave me, again, this really first-person set of experiences that, frankly, when I was in college, even a few years earlier, I never, ever would have imagined, swiping a badge and walking in the front door of some of these places. It would have been the last thing on my mind. And I appreciate that opportunity because I think it gave me a more nuanced view into how that world works, how contracting works, even just what the environments feel like to be there, the different types of personalities that you run into, both amongst the government employees and contractors. So I did that for 15 years. In 2019, got a really unique opportunity because I was very connected with the world of archives. I was conference chair for an archival conference put on by the Association of Moving Image Archivists, very passionate about archives and the preservation of rich media. And I got in touch with this firm I had learned about that was like a Boston-based startup. I'm originally from Mass. I was still in Baltimore. I still am in Baltimore. But they were developing as a startup synthetic DNA-based data storage and computing technology.
Mm-hmm.
Let's spit out custom synthesized DNA molecules that can actually capture digital information. And then the next step, aspirationally for them, although they were starting to develop some techniques and thinking around it, was how do you compute on data when it's in molecular form without having to kind of re-digitize it and put it in a traditional IT system?
So was this a product, or was this all at the research and development?
Well, they actually did build a technology base in that, just not to devolve this into DNA data storage exclusively, because we could talk for hours about it. But if you think about a DNA molecule, we have these 4 nucleotide molecules that exist within the molecule, right? The A, T, C, and G. And you can kind of think that, you can kind of think of a basic mapping scheme between digital information with ones and zeros, and now this kind of 4 base encoding scheme. And other efforts, frankly, even over decades, had started to play with capturing digital information in that form by simply doing mappings of zeros and ones to the 4 letters. And so you could kind of have a custom sequence where you now can have each thing represent 00, 01, 10, or 11. You have kind of quaternary or whatever it's called, values to work with. However, Catalog DNA, the name of the company that I worked with and was with for about a year and helped get them through their Series A round of fundraising. And if someone wants to look up my involvement, I have a couple of talks on YouTube. Then when I was with them, I gave, kind of describing the technology and the approach of the company a little more detailed, and they can just look up Nick Gold Catalog DNA on YouTube. However, note, there's also a Nick Goldman, who's an actual scientist who's very involved with DNA data storage, and that's not me. I'm Nick Gold. That's Nick Goldman. He's British. I'm American. So these are 2 by me. And instead of just coming up with this basic mapping system, which is very slow using today's DNA synthesis technology, you obviously read the data. Obviously, I shouldn't say it's obvious. You read the data by sequencing it using the same kind of DNA sequencers. However, if you have that basic mapping scheme of 0110, 0011 to the 4 bases, to actually create those molecules synthetically is very time consuming relative to writing something onto your flash drive or even a hard drive or whatever. It takes a while through these chemical synthesis processes, and those are always speeding up. However, what Catalog had done was this utterly novel approach that just utterly fascinated me. They built this room-sized device about the size of the room I'm in right now. Not a huge room, but a modest living room in a Baltimore row home, that used inkjet printer technology to deposit DNA sequences that they had already synthesized, and essentially combine them and sort of stitching the sequences together enzymatically using enzymes that can kind of pair the sequences you've generated to create longer DNA sequences.
It's a DNA 3D printer, essentially.
Yes, but think of it. So this is what we were creating. We actually were giving up, or the company still is under their current work, kind of some of the density that you can get, because you have a lot of density to spare because these molecules are really tiny. However, it takes a while to combine them and write it out and everything. So what Catalog developed was this approach where they kind of created this set of possible DNA molecules that are longer, again, these kind of stitched together ones. And you can kind of think of each molecule as being a unique indicator for a particular binary digit space in your encoding job. So think you have an encoding job. At the end of the day, it's going to amount to a series of zeros and ones. You have developed a schema where you have a sequence that represents, you can almost think of it as like a molecular IP address for a particular bit in that encoding job. And if we rapidly combine the molecules and in this test tube that you get at the end of the process, if that molecule is present in your sample, because you know which position of the encoding job it maps to, if you've created it, it's a 1. If that molecule is not to be found in that sample, it's a 0. So they could actually have dozens and dozens of these inkjet nozzles. I encourage people to look up catalog DNA and look at some of the videos. It's really fascinating stuff. And it's still being developed, of course. It's, I'd say, pre-commercial. They're, I think, beginning projects with various companies and organizations. And that's some of what I was involved in bringing to the table with them. But it's just this fascinating thing. It is mechanical. It does demonstrate very unique, novel approaches relative to those other mapping techniques. And now there's kind of like this nascent DNA data storage industry group that they're part of and other organizations are part of. So, it took something that interesting to pull me away from this great career that I had developed with the firm here in Baltimore for 15 years. And so I did that, got them through their Series A, decided that was probably a good point to depart. I had some other things in mind. Ended up working for another larger systems integrator for a while. A good friend of mine is the principal there, the owner. They do big compute cluster type stuff for government and other kinds of operations. And that was really cool. Also worked for a Spanish software technology company that does the kind of data management for media solutions. I had known them for years and was friendly with a lot of their staff and worked for them for a year to help try to expand their market in the US as their US rep. And, that wrapped up at the end of, let me think about it now, 2022. And I was like, okay, I have had 15 years with a systems integrator, 3 years of working with some of these other firms in the space, including like the wildest technology startup, out of a sci-fi novel that I could ever think of, which was super cool. I decided to just take a little breath, take a break, say, what am I really trying to do at this point? And, I had been, as a UFO geek, watching the UFO space from December 2017 onward quite closely.
Sure.
Represented kind of a
New York Times article drop and all the subsequent
new era. Fascinated. This seemed credible. Couldn't believe it was a above the fold story in the New York Times. This was clearly new. Out of all of my decades of interest in the topic, that was kind of a different thing. So I decided, and I had been thinking this for a while, having that familiarity with DC and how topics get wrangled in DC and how policy is made in DC and the various types of organizations that emerge to support not just issues, but like every take on every issue. I didn't see almost any of that for the UAP topic or government UAP transparency broadly. There were some nonprofits like SCU and others that are, in the kind of scientific exploration of UAP arena. But there weren't really, the kinds of policy orgs. In fact, there weren't any.
Or like a PAC or anything.
None of that stuff. No lobbyists or, Steve Bassett has talked about being a UFO lobbyist for years, but there weren't lobbyist firms. It wasn't like as kind of serious. I mean, those for various issues, you have big, shiny buildings in downtown DC with hundreds of employees. And I wasn't thinking, on day one, the UAP transparency issue would resemble that. But it seemed like the kind of topic that deserved to have an emerging formalized presence to engage with policymakers and government folks and, put certain ideas out there. So I had been kind of wrestling for a while with what version of that. Was it a think tank? Is it a PAC? Is it, what are we trying to do here? And, I wanted to be somewhat independent, or at least capable of independence. And I was looking at things like a 501c3. And the problem with that is you can't really do effective lobbying around specific legislation. You're prevented from doing that above a very small percentage of your overall effort. And that was going to be central to what I really felt passionate about. Looked at a 501c4, which is kind of, a I forget what they're called specifically, but it's a nonprofit that can do lobbying, but you still need several members of your board. It's a more formal process of even standing the organization up. And I kind of wanted to take the DIY, do it yourself approach and ethos to this. I didn't want to be incumbent. I had put some feelers out to see if folks, even some of these UFO names, were interested in such a thing at that time. Wasn't getting a lot of feedback. And then, a friend of mine, one point, he was like, Nick, you should just, whatever it is, just go in your own direction, do your own thing. At this time, you have all these people doing podcasts and YouTubes and whatever it is. You're a communicator, you have very interesting interests in this stuff, whether it's UAP or other things. Like, just find your passion and run with it, man. And for some reason, Michael, it was like a switch flipped in my head. And I had the vision for what I wanted to do, which emerged into Declassify UAP, or declassifyuap.org, which I encourage people to go to right now as they're listening, because they can go to the Action Center, because this is a big part of it. I wanted to create a platform that both presented very grounded information about the state of UAP and UAP policy, and also to lobby and push for UAP transparency in the government and for our elected officials to take very specific actions and embrace the topic. I wanted to do it myself, so I stood it up as an LLC. That was all very easy. And then I wanted the website with very grounded information that looked just as professional and reasonable as any other kind of issue website that a person might go to. And if anyone's ever gone to a web page for a cause they care about, they're probably familiar with like the Action Center, which Declassify UAP has in a very kind of prominent place, which has that little form you can fill out, just a few fields of personal information, and you hit a button, and the back-end platform routes your message to your own elected officials as a U.S. voter, because that's what I was focusing on. And so it hits your congressional rep, your 2 senators, the president, the vice president. And, we have kind of a pre-written blurb, and it gets people into the habit of engaging with their elected officials around the UAP transparency topic as a kind of grounded issue. Like, we can treat it and respond to it and, engage with our reps around it, just like we do other issues we care about. It doesn't have to be treated differently for whatever reason. It needs to normalize kind of the issueification, if you will, of the UAP topic. And so I just happened to know a guy who was a web designer who had done Jacques Vallée's website, and he was available and gave me a great friends and family rate. I did kind of, again, I worked with commercial technology solutions. So, I evaluated the vendors of those voter engagement platforms and got a good deal on one because they happened to be geeks for UFOs, or at least a few of the key people were. So, I got a great deal on that. And that's a voter voice, which is, kind of the heart of the Action Center of the declassifyuap.org website. And I stood it up, and it was funny. I started to put this together about a week into June in 2023. It took me kind of 6 months of mulling this over, and then my friend kind of in June, gave me this tip that kind of pointed me in the right direction. Well, within like a week or two, I think, or around that time, David Grush was coming out, and like right thereafter, a month later, was the major hearing in the House, with David Grush and Fravor and Ryan Graves. And I managed to get into that hearing. If anyone watches that and looks at any of Dave Fravor's testimony, they're going to see my head grinning like an idiot in the background, because I was like utterly amazed to be there, and like that this historical moment, I really think it was occurring, and I just thought it was groovy. So I might have even done it from the House, from that room that they had the hearing in. I decided, okay, today I'm going to actually register to be a federal lobbyist, because that's a process. You have to fill out some paperwork and do both quarterly and biannual reports and stuff, and report your spend and all of these things. I wanted to do it officially. I wanted to cross every T, dot every I. So I registered, and then it was interesting. Politico apparently trolls, or just kind of looks at and monitors the postings, the registrations. They reached out to me. They were like, "Hey, do you want to be kind of the focus of one of our pieces today on the lobbying beat? Because this is interesting. We just had this hearing. Maybe you can do that." So Politico covered Declassify UAP's formation. Within a couple of weeks, I had been on News Nation a couple times because they saw the Politico report. And then eventually, because again, the UAP Disclosure Act then got announced like again on July 14th. And I was already in the process of putting together the website. I was like, oh, well, that's handy. That gives us sort of on a platter a bill to sort of rally some support around.
Yeah.
It may or may not be the end-all, be-all piece of legislation that gets this over the finish line, but it's like this was given to us by the Senate leader, like on a platter. So, that could kind of focus some of our legislative engagement efforts. And that was just kind of funny, quinky dink. And, I did some collaborating, found people online who, at the time seemed in line with my own thinking. Some of that is evolving in the current climate, but, was able to kind of find a network of people pushing for this in a similar way at the time. And, threw myself into social media, which I'd always been active in UAP social media for decades, from like the early to mid 90s onward, but came out kind of using my own name with my org behind me. Yeah. And people generally responded quite well. I wouldn't say universally, but I think a lot of people really liked the grounded, reasonable approach. So I've been doing that ever since. Again, I'm kind of still on professional hiatus for my media technology career. Yeah, always evaluating options there. At some point I need to have an honest living again, but that's where I stand. Things are evolving rapidly in terms of the political environment, if you want to call it that, in the United States. I have, frankly, some major concerns about how the UAP issue dovetails into this, and that, unfortunately, it looks like the UAP cause, perhaps from the genesis of this roughly 7-year period, has been somewhat co-opted by folks who I am not in alignment with, and unfortunately seem like they're quite supportive of the very undemocratic and anti-constitutional things that are occurring right now. And I think people need to be extremely discriminating about that. I think the constitutional basis of the United States is more important than UAP transparency. And I've been obsessed with UAP transparency for 40 years. But, we're not going to get any version of it that's useful or even potentially truthful when not great folks are the ones bringing it forth through a very particular set of dynamics. And that gives me some very grave concerns about UAP transparency in this climate. So, I'm evaluating how does one even respond to that. I can't really use X at this point because my family, some of them were annihilated by Nazis in World War II. And Elon Musk is a fascist. And he is sig-hailing publicly, and he reposts all sorts of nasty anti-Semitic racist stuff. So I had to pull off of the main social media platform, or one of them that people use to talk about the UAP topic. I'm on Blue Sky now. You can just look up Declassify UAP on Blue Sky. I continue to observe some very kind of troubling attitudes and behaviors and kind of excuses for what's going on in the larger UAP community, including by some of the big names that people are quite familiar with at this point. And this is almost on a daily basis now. I see things that I find highly questionable about their approach, to the point it makes me wonder if UFOs were really the focus all along, or was that an issue that was being used to pull people into a certain kind of anti-governmental feeling so that they would feel better about the government being demolished. So that's a mouthful, but that's kind of where I'm at right today. And thankfully, I'm personally doing great, but I think every American and frankly, people around the world have a lot of reasons to be keeping their eyes on the news and be very concerned about the overall state of things right now.
Certainly, I agree. And let me take this moment in the conversation to say plainly that I tend to want conversations that I have on this show to be apolitical as much as possible. But the reality is that politics is not a discrete sphere of activity that can be totally distinguished from anything else we do. I mean, politics is part of reality itself, and reality has a kind of unity to it. And there are points in the sort of political history of any society where it's probably easier or harder to stay on one side of the line, and times when that line becomes really, really fuzzy and blurry. So I'll just say that I take it as my responsibility to make these conversations as reasonably apolitical as possible, but it's not the obligation of the guest to do that. So I want you to feel free to speak your perspective on this topic in and not feel like there's any expectation that you dice up or distinguish UAP topic from anything else, whether it's science or politics or religion or whatever it is. I think that those lines all get blurred. Well,
let me just quickly interject with this. It's interesting. This is a kind of a funny story. It goes back maybe about a year or two, a couple years. I was taking a walk. One of the areas that I focused on when I was with the Galileo project, and in fact, it's this thinking that got me listed as one of the co-authors on the lead Galileo project paper. I was very proud of that. It was a very minor contribution, but the intro to that paper, this is the Waters et al. Paper, you'll find a number of references towards the beginning relating to the terminology around the topic, UAP, UFO, and some of the challenges that those terms introduce because of their vagueness and their ambiguity and nebulousness. We could throw a few other words on there, but it's basically, they're very vague. And, they almost are anti-labels. I worked in the media technology field, including database platforms where you have to come up with metadata schemas and think about the ontology of your schema and what ontology is represented by a particular set of both schematic approaches, but also the individual labels to kind of have a conception of information. And I learned through my career that how you refer to things is extremely important. It defines the contours of our thinking about a topic because we're language-based species. So I was very dissatisfied with this vague and kind of nebulous terminology, these anti-labels, kind of saying what we're not talking about or the vagueness of what we're talking about, but without actually describing it. And I was taking a walk one day, and I think I was trying to come up with a better word than UFO that actually gave some connotation of what we're talking about with these objects or phenomena, which are, heterogeneous in nature. So you can't just say round, shiny objects that, look like advanced aerospace vehicles or whatever. It has to be some holistic thing that connotes. And for whatever reason, the term hyperobject popped into my head. I hadn't heard the term before. I wasn't familiar with its use outside of UAP, although I quickly came to be. It just seemed like these are objects, most of them. You could even call a luminous light source kind of an object from just a purely referential standpoint. And they're just extreme objects with these outlier capabilities. And so this term came into my head. I was like, hyperobject. I like that. I wonder if anyone's ever coined it. So I, get home or whatever, and I Google it.
And I find being the philosopher who's kind of worked on.
There's a thinker. I think he's at Rice. I'm blanking on his name.
Of Kripal, maybe.
No, Kripal has referenced it, but the original guy who coined this term hyperobject. I think
it's Tim Morton, right?
Yes, it's Morton.
Yeah.
So I read his thing, and again, I'm familiar with things like knowledge graphs and ontologies and even a technological frame of thinking. And he has this notion of hyperobject. So if you think of a knowledge graph, which is what our world is essentially, and also how we characterize our world these days, it's a bunch of nodes connected by a bunch of edges. And these often have kind of semantic relationships that are defined by the various edges that connect these conceptual nodes. And a hyperobject is this very complex cluster of nodes and edges with high dimensionality of connectivity, not only within the hyperobject, but between the hyperobject and all sorts of other concepts. And Morton was very oriented around kind of thinking of ecology in these terms. I was like, that's also perfect to describe these things, because UFOs as this concept, it inherently ties into politics, government secrecy and operations, the military, philosophy, religion. I was like, so that term hyperobject is both really kind of a good descriptor of the things themselves, and then this deeper layer of meaning as these highly complex informational structures that just jut into absolutely everything. So I was like, okay, hyperobjects they are. And then like a year or two later, I guess some other philosopher, I have his book, I can't remember what his name was. He has this book that came out about kind of UFOs as hyperobjects using Morton's thinking behind it.
James Madden is the
Madden. I really enjoyed the book.
Unidentified flying hyperobjects, I think, is the name of the book.
And then the term started to kind of get picked up, and I've seen various people kind of use the term, again, thinking more in this kind of knowledge graph graphy framework for it. But again, it also seems to really describe these things. So, I think it's only natural, and it's frankly probably necessary. It doesn't mean we have to be biased in our thinking. It doesn't mean we ourselves as individuals need to align to a particular religious viewpoint or place on the political spectrum. I'm a registered Democrat. I'll put that out there bluntly because I live in Baltimore. And if you want to vote in any primaries that mean anything, you have to be a registered Democrat. However, I was an independent before moving to Baltimore. And so I consider myself very politically independent. I have my own life that I live. It's pretty boring at this point in some ways, other than being a UFO geek, I suppose.
Which is also boring in its own way. I mean,
right?
Read books and we go online and all that.
Exactly. It's very wonkish. So, I wouldn't even call myself, a person who stands out necessarily, along a political ideology. I have some viewpoints that some people would, at least in traditional times, consider quite conservative. I believe in things like border security or whatever. I also believe that we should have reasonable immigration policies, and we can kind of find happy mediums here through normal political processes anyway. So I've always considered myself an independent thinker on pretty much anything. Just as an aside, I come from fairly progressive community in Western Massachusetts, the whole Amherst, Northampton, College Town area. I moved from there to Baltimore for college. And it's like my conception of the American ideal, really probably the only thing that could hold a place as diverse as America together, was this notion that's really, frankly, fairly libertarian in its leaning of, especially at least when it comes to social issues, is if someone isn't messing with you directly, like, we're going to kind of have to learn to tolerate them. Doesn't mean you have to love what they're up to. Doesn't mean you have to adopt how they live their lives. We have to sort of have this capability of living in proximity with one another that is based first and foremost on a certain base level of tolerance. And this all seems to be just kind of largely thrown in the air in today's political climate. But I consider that, frankly, a quite conservative viewpoint in many ways. Many people would consider that a very conservative standpoint. Now, I also believe in government and, social welfare systems and all that. So, we're all a hodgepodge. None of us really are somewhere that the needle pins on some imaginary meter. We really do have to look at things issue by issue, and issues are complex and nuanced. So anyway, with that aside, because, some people might think of me as being this guy or that guy or this set of views, or I can look at how you look at UFOs and understand what you think about everything else. That's just simply not true. Like, we have to have actually deep discussions to get at the heart of these things. So, anyway, I can't remember even where we were leaving off.
I think we were going in the direction of acknowledging that this phenomena that we're all unified by an interest in is so heterogeneous and has tendrils that go into so many other different areas of life that it's not always possible to speak about it in this restrictive sort of conscripted way where we say, oh, we're just talking about UFOs. We're not really talking about science or religion or philosophy or politics.
And that's right, Michael. And, let me say this, because I know we want to talk about experiencer stuff today. Also not a label I'm totally in love with, and we should talk about that aspect too. But I'll say this. Some of the people I worked very directly with over the last couple of years of Declassify UAP, almost a year and a half or so of the organization being formally stood up, which includes some of the big names, some of whom I've interacted with directly and done some work with. We all have our viewpoints. And I knew that a number of the people out there had different overall political viewpoints or social viewpoints or whatever than I did. And there were a few moments where I had to grit my teeth a little bit, but they were doing a pretty good job for the most part of keeping that a little back and really making the focus on transparency and the rightness of pursuing that, which I firmly believe. And so, I think a lot of people were able to walk elbow in elbow and get some good stuff done and, help, champion the cause and et cetera. Unfortunately, over the last 1 to 2 weeks, literally, we're recording this on February 10th. Since February 1, some of those very same figures have decided to not do that anymore and to kind of throw down with the current administration and the current approaches, including things like Doge, which is flagrantly illegal in the activities that it's involved with, which is being found by judges. And that's troubling to me because that signals that, they're really following political expediency more than an approach that they had frankly maintained for years.
Right.
And I find that troubling for a variety of reasons, because I think democracy is more important than UAP transparency on any given day. Maybe UAP transparency should be part of a democratic process. But, it's funny. One of the reasons a person like me wanted UAP transparency to come out in a reasonable way for us, I say again and again, for us to be leveled with by the officials. And simply, I have these declassification targets that are listed on my website. They have their own section in the nav bar. Put together 7 areas, rich media actually showing UAP more clearly, at least summaries of what the data indicates about these things, information on intelligence assessments. That seems obvious enough. It's the IC. That's what they generate largely, intelligence assessments. Yet we haven't been given any actual intelligence assessments on what they think the real outlier UAP might be indicative of. Well, that seems important and useful for the public to know. So I laid out these things, and again, the whole point was reasonableness and kind of, meeting the institutions halfway. They have security, concerns that are reasonable. They have, potentially, if UAP are these things that have energy capabilities that make nuclear, power and weaponry look like a joke, theoretically or hypothetically, well, that would be something you would have to keep very safe and, preserve and might lead to, especially in the mid-1940s, regimes of secrecy around it that we might not consider, healthy in hindsight, but like they might have had at least reasons for it that over decades and decades become very difficult to unwind. So I was always about extending the hand to some of these very agencies that I had done some limited but work with, right? Like I've dealt with some of these agencies, and I did not ever really get the impression like they're mostly filled with people sitting around in boardrooms conspiring against the American people. It's just not how it works.
But that's too simplistic and sort of maniacal an idea about how societies go bad.
And yet cover-ups do lead over time to people kind of entering that headspace, and it kind of gives them some reasons to. So I always wanted to kind of build bridges, and I still do, with the realm of officialdom, including the contractors, even if they've had involvement, and the government. And, I'm really oriented around kind of a truth and reconciliation model at this point. And yet it's now becoming increasingly clear to me that a number of people in UFO world really are happy to burn absolutely everything down if it means maybe getting some version of a truth about UAP. And again, I think a person can look at a willingness to tear down everything and ask reasonably, was UAP really the focus of your concerns, or was UAP a very convenient topic to use to drum up a certain ideology? And there's been anti-governmental type folks who have latched onto UAP. I mean, behold a pale horse and all of that for decades and decades. And again, I think everyone needs to be just extraordinarily discerning right now, because UAP are important, but so is like the basis of our society. And to think that like in the midst of absolute chaos, even if a few chunks of possible truths about UAP came out, and even if they were true and not manipulations in their own right, because nothing says manipulation about the UAP topic just has to end at this point. Let's say we were given a few truths about it. Is that a really healthy societal place to be in? Or is it only going to be used for, frankly, even maybe nefarious purposes to get people in line around ideologies that are potentially very dangerous? So, yeah.
I think that's a coherent warning, and I'm happy to let it rest there. I'd love to talk about your particular encounters with not the subject, but with the objects themselves or the phenomena themselves. I normally have some sort of pre-recorded conversation to at least sketch out the territory of what we're going to be talking about. But in this series, I'm not doing that. I'm having the conversation for the first time sort of live. And I don't know what your experience has been like. And I don't know how much you're willing to share. But I know that you've had some sort of experience, and I'd love to hear however much you're willing to talk about.
Yeah. Thank you. And I appreciate that opportunity to be open-ended about it. And the sensitivity you exhibit, because it is a sensitive topic. So again, kind of rewinding, when I was growing up, Western Massachusetts, again, moved to Baltimore at 18-ish, to go to college. But I only learned this years later. So these things that would have been happening in probably the 80s, maybe 90s, I learned about in the aughts or even the teens. Turns out at least one of my relatively close family members was having their own set of experiences in an ongoing way when I was growing up, near me. And this was an individual who wasn't, just whether it was because of the background, how this person is wired, a variety of things. I don't think ever really truly found comfort in being able to reckon with their experiences. These involved very close proximity types of quote unquote encounters or outlier experience, little tiny light sources, caught in the hand and then opened and then floating and then kind of communication occurring.
Wow.
In the middle of the afternoon kind of thing, like the backyard, and other things, missing time. There was some other weird ones. And again, I learned about these decades after the fact. I was like, that's interesting. I can't make a direct link between that, and my fascination with the topic. Again, there was plenty of pop culture to get me excited, and I never would have guessed that this was occurring.
So this person, you mean?
Yeah, like I didn't know about it at the time, and I only learned about it years and years later. But it's interesting to at least contemplate if things like that are at least being subjectively perceived in your relative proximity. Could there be a few other edges, connecting nodes there between my own interest and the topic? Who knows? There's a chance that even maybe some other family members were having that. And let me tell you, I was having some pretty outlier experiences as a kid as well, that I was really cognizant of even in elementary school. And I think this ties to it largely. So that's why I'll go back and even talk about this stuff. So I had a lot of lucid dreams as an elementary schooler. They were very stimulating to me. Made me think about the nature of who I am and consciousness. And, how can I be in this virtual space, a dream, quote unquote, where I can hear things, I can knock on things and feel them. It's obviously not directly similar to my day-to-day lived experience, but here I am in this imaginal realm that's apparently in my head or brain or something, and yet I'm a conscious entity within it, and there are all these other characters and landscapes, and what the fuck is going on here? So that was very interesting, and I think inspiring to kind of just think about reality in a way, frankly, most of my peers didn't seem to be, or most adults or anyone, and that stuck with me.
How old were you about that time?
I would guess that this was happening between the ages of 7, 8, and 12-ish.
Okay.
That window, I mean, these things were certainly occurring. And, I grew up, my mom's fairly new agey. Wasn't anything shoved down our throats or anything. But concepts of meditation or, kind of things like that, were at least familiar to me. Now, this is another, again, relate it how you will. My father passed away very unexpectedly when I was, 3 3/4 years old, 3 and a half about.
I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah. Well,
you probably don't remember it. Yeah.
No. When people say they're sorry, I'm like, did you kill the guy?
Man.
So, but thank you. But what's interesting about this is, that imparts in a young person traumas and concerns and other things. I'm not going to say it didn't. However, I don't ever really remember in elementary school in the years following this ever feeling like I was wronged by the universe or that this was unfair. If anything, it kind of made me interrogate the nature of reality more. I was like, okay, yeah, I'm going to research things about bad stuff happening in the world and holocausts and murder. This is also the real world. Whatever's going on includes not only the loss of life, but violence and people committing horrible atrocities on one another. Whatever the truth is about the ultimate nature of reality, and I have always been very focused on that, like what is the ultimate nature of reality and how do I relate to it? I'll be satisfied with nothing less. So a worldview has to encompass all of that,
Sure.
including like your father suddenly dropping dead over the course of an afternoon from an undiagnosed cancer. So that I think also stimulated me to think about, mortality, and that I knew that nothing was guaranteed. I could drop dead at, any moment or get hit by a car or whatever. And I think if anything, that prodded me even more to just want to interrogate the ultimate nature of reality and how I relate to it. So on a strange level, I'm sort of like thankful karmically that it inspired me in such a way, or at least that I was able to take that from a traumatic event, right? So, that was part of my upbringing and thus gave me a very philosophical, I've taken a few philosophy classes in college. I'm not an academic philosopher, but I am a street philosopher. I'm comfortable, embracing myself.
Yeah.
And so like, in elementary school, I went to a small school. My class in elementary was about 14, 15 kids. Great elementary school in Western Massachusetts in one of the little hill towns around Amherst area. And, I had friends and we played soccer and kickball and handball with the big rubber balls against the wall of the school at recess and all the typical stuff. Rode bikes around on weekends, played Nintendo Entertainment System, the 80s, child upbringing, which was awesome.
Yeah.
Great time to be an elementary schooler was the 80s. You got your Transformers and your G.I. Joes and everything. So sometimes I would take walks at recess, and I took a lot of walks just for fun, even down my street. It was wooded and really nice in kind of a rural area. And sometimes I would take walks at recess with friends, and we would have like weird, geeky, intellectual conversations as elementary school kids. But sometimes I would just like walk around myself, maybe listening to like even, cassette Walkman or something. And, I was deeply kind of philosophical in a sense. And, I had a few just concrete revelations that really stuck with me up through today and through my life. I mean, I was like, and again, I'm not a math guy at all. Like it bores me. It's just, it's my brain doesn't latch onto it. But conceptually it fascinates me. And I don't know how this popped into my head, but I remember walking around one day and just looking around. Maybe I think probably around the soccer field and at my school and looking at the trees around the field. And I was like, this is all one unfolding equation.
Mm.
And I mean, I didn't know what an algorithm probably was at that point or whatever. Decades later, I see that that's kind of a hip way of thinking about reality or whatever. This was just coming somewhat spontaneously to me for whatever reason. It just seemed utterly obvious. I was like, yeah, I can see the connectivity between things and they're all kind of, everything that led up to this moment, which I've learned is sort of the concept of karma, original concept of karma as action, and actions have reactions. Like everything is the result of everything that led up to that. It felt very mathematical in a sense. But I also had another strange conception, which was, I'm not actually this guy. I'm not this body. And I'm not even really my mind or my thoughts or whatever. I'm the thing that's looking out through this. And obviously over decades of learning, that's consciousness in a nutshell. But I had this really stark realization that I was like, I have this thing. But like even logically, you can really think about it logically. And I learned many years later that this was kind of the essence of Ramana Maharshi's self-inquiry technique of asking, who am I? But it's what I did. And again, the lucid dreams and everything kind of fueled it. Like, who's the me even thinking this thought right now? Who is me? And I was like, well, it's not a body. And it's not like a fleshy brain. And you can't even really say the meanness that's involved is some spontaneous electrical activity or biochemical activity or neuronal frameworks. Like I can close my eyes and I did a lot of meditation probably without even realizing it from being a kid.
Yep.
And it's like there is this me-ness that remains, this observer, this witness to reality. Why the hell aren't we talking about this in school? It seems so obvious. Like, shouldn't this be like kind of an important thing? We're all acting like you're whatever your name is. And I was like, what is like, and well, I'll just say it. I also was like, am I an alien?
Yeah. I mean, that's probably the only word that you have for this realization that you're not the thing that we all think we are. Yeah.
Well, and on that level, but also just relative to my peers, I was like, why am I thinking this all the time? And it's not even like something we touch on in school. No other adults are talking about it. Now, I did start to develop at least a fascination with religion and philosophy at a pretty young age. I decided I want to do a bar mitzvah. You know, half my family is Jewish. So I was like really motivated to do that because it seemed like a pathway into people who had thought those deeper questions about things, and it was sort of the domain that a lot of that contemplation occurs in. Not to say I was rabidly religious or anything, but it was like, well, at least that's a territory where some of these deeper concepts seem to emerge more.
It was the only available road into that kind of philosophical thinking that you were really interested in.
Now, by the time I was in junior high, I was like reading about the Monroe Institute and channeling and all sorts of weird stuff. Again, I had a new agey mom. I grew up in a pretty progressive area. It wasn't that difficult to kind of find that stuff. But, you know, even years before finding it, I was just still like, why isn't this much more commonly being referred to in our day-to-day experiences? This would seem like the kind of thing that like should deeply motivate how we live our lives and how we conceive of ourselves and our relationship with other. And I was just baffled, thus like, what am I, an alien? And it also relates to your point of this thing that is the me-ness that I am is not a human being in the sense that if we define a human being as something that exists on the taxonomy of primates and it's flesh and blood, and we can describe its biology and its genetics and like whatever is here thinking, who am I, is not that.
Yes, or at least not merely that. It's not.
It might be some weird symbiotic relationship. Is it another layer? And the thing I am is both that me-ness and it has a body, but there's some larger structure that the totality of whatever I am is, and it includes all of these things, but isn't limited to this biological monkey suit running around. And again, this whole time, I was deeply interested in UFOs. I was always looking in the sky, like always expecting them to kind of show up one day. And so all of this was Nick by the time I freaking graduated elementary school in 1990 and really, really just consumed me as I started exploring a lot of interesting topics. I'll just throw in one more. I started getting exposed to someone who was interested in computers and technology, even in elementary school. We had a Commodore 64 at home. I loved it. Did all that stuff. Got our first real computer with a modem, I should say. When I say real computer, a computer with a modem, because my friends were kind of into the BBS scene and dialing up and even some internet stuff. And so I think in 7th grade, we got like a 286 desktop computer with a modem. I got a modem. I installed the card, and I had a few geeky friends who could show me how this works, some of which have gone on to have very successful technology careers, these guys. So we did the BBS thing and whatever. And so that was like 91 and 91 into 92. I also started reading cyberpunk science fiction at the exact same time. And here I am.
Neil Stephenson sort of stuff.
Neil Stephenson, William Gibson, those kind of guys. Those would be the two big names. It was Snow Crash, and then it was the William Gibson Sprawl trilogy, and then the rest of the Gibson stuff. And what's fascinating about those works, and it's almost never discussed in kind of a critique of the cyberpunk genre or those works specifically, is that they're highly esoteric. Like there is very blatantly this notion of cyberspace as a technologized astral realm, and this realm even has its own denizens. And those denizens,
something we've just created, is something that we're accessing through a kind of,
and it's vague. Like in Gibson's Sprawl trilogy, there's are they AIs? Are they the AI embodiments of something that exists beyond that technological realm. So that was a very interesting set of frameworks to also start to absorb as I'm having these esoteric thoughts about the nature of consciousness, reality, astral realm versus physical realm, and the lucid dream space. And then there's this notion of cyberspace as the etheric realm with its own set of denizens. And I was like, really started to realize, I was like, I live in an interesting time of history.
Yes.
Like, within a few decades, this stuff is going to be off the walls. I'm going to be living in these books that I'm reading, and here we are. Hello, from the future. You know, like everyone was going to be online and virtual side of our lives and realities, and everything was going to be hooked up and connected. And like, I realized, wow, this is deep. This is interesting. It's potentially problematic. A lot of those books also get into like the distortions of power structures and democracy and other things that start to emerge in that state. Which,
new forms
hello
of
again.
society that weren't
Here we are.
Yeah.
So, this all kind of fueled little Nick, who just went into college and stayed into UFOs and got even more into it. I was following people like Greer from the late 90s. I actually went to, it was sort of a satellite event to the main Disclosure Project event at the National Press Club in 2001. For people on his mailing list, the Disclosure Project or CSETI or whatever it was, they had kind of like a satellite event. I think it was within days of the main event. I think it was at the Reagan building or something. But anyway, I remember going with my girlfriend at the time, and it was like, probably 2/3 of the witnesses that were at the NPC event were there. You got to interact with them directly. I remember meeting Danny Sheehan and the woman who was Von Braun's assistant and the other folks, the guy from FAA. So like, I was able to kind of like be physically proximate to the people kind of doing work around the space or whatever. That was kind of interesting. Again, that was in 2001. So it's almost a quarter of a century back now. I had one other really interesting experience. I choose not to go into it in super detail here, but I'll describe it as such.
Just go as far as you're happy to go.
Yeah, and it was in 2001. And I had an experience that, from my subjective point of view, felt like a contact experience. Mm-hmm. And like a visceral one and kind of unexpected. And it was very temporary. It was very quick. Probably minute to minutes, but very visceral. And it actually dramatically shifted my thinking about everything at that point. And it was a very impactful experience. And I'll maybe state it as such, learning about the nature of things and going to college. And I had a minor in political science. I'm learning about authoritarian regimes. I'm reading about, again, funny where I would end up, doing some of my professional career, but reading about like the Five Eyes and the NSA's Project Echelon, and oh my God, all of this emerging, technology stuff is just monitoring us and watching us and spying on us. And, like many people do who get into UFOs, who get into kind of like government conspiracy stuff, it can be very overwhelming. It can be a little psychologically destabilizing, or I guess for some people, very psychologically destabilizing. And you just feel this weight. And I think a lot of people in UFO world, I'm not trying to say I'm like ahead of the times or whatever, but maybe I was, because like I get the sense a lot of people in UFO world now are kind of in this mode. And it's almost why
feeling a weight, a kind of ambient,
this weight of society and conspiracy and being watched. I mean, I was feeling this before 24/7 internet connectivity of every human being, and knowing these companies are spying on us and actually having AIs we can have full-fledged conversations with. I mean, I was feeling that weight in the late 90s, 2000, 2001 timeframe. And again, it's like, how deep does this conspiracy go? And they're still on my shelf. They're up there. You can probably read them. A couple of David Icke books, Icke, that can be very destabilizing. It's very dark. It gives you a very particular taste, and it's not really rooted in tons of hard facts. It's really kind of more of an ideology, if you will. And
his views are like reptilian people running the government and stuff.
Oh, absolutely. And all of that stuff. I mean, the shapeshifters and the British Queen rips off her mask, and it's one of the reptiles from V or whatever. And like, even if you don't take them all totally literally, which some people do, and like everyone is like, gosh, could it even be this weird? Because the moment any UFO stuff ties into some non-human intelligence or whatever, admittedly, And realistically, you have to kind of be like almost any possibility is on the table. And I say this to people all the time. I'm like, one of the things that is so damaging about UFO secrecy is the gap between the knowns and the possibles is so vast a chasm, you can fill it with anything. And it all kind of sounds like it could be the case. And so huge mythologies erupt around the topic that like you don't necessarily have any grounded sense of. So like feeling that weight and just that kind of like, and this world is out to get me, and like, it's an icky feeling. And again, no pun intended, given the guy's name is Icky. And again, I think it's a mode many people in UFO world are in. I've observed it time and time again. And there's a lot of people, and I feel it. I know what they're going through. Well, it's so weird because, again, this experience that felt like a contact experience. I want to be very specific with the language I use because I can't say what happened. I thought it was a physical experience at first. And within, I'd say, minutes, I realized that it might have been more quote unquote psychic in nature or mental or internal. It still felt visceral to the point I was looking for UFOs out the window, thinking I would probably see something. But then like kind of like getting my wits about me and being like, I don't know. It felt like it was in the room, but like, was it? Was it that proximate, or did it, it almost maybe felt like a breakthrough experience, like, that people describe with DMT. And I will say there was a psychedelic component to the experience, which just adds to the confusion of how to interpret such a thing from a subjective standpoint.
You mean there was a psychedelic component in the sense that you were taking a psychedelic?
Yes, I had done a psychedelic, but it was totally unlike every psychedelic experience, that I'd done, and not obsessed with that realm, but it just stood very much apart. Again, it was a little bit more like a breakthrough experience where it was very visceral and in your face, but also not quite tangible and even very difficult to describe other than there was a presence there. And I don't feel like much was communicated with me, frankly. But I guess I could say the message that I received was, you don't have to worry about the man, the big structure, the conspiracy. You don't have to have that weight. It was really go back to what you feel like like what is in your core of your being and your perspectives on things. And you can have a lot of faith that that's going to keep you well protected from anything you're worried about. Those things are just kind of like shoddy constructs of what's really going on. Like the deeper thing you're already in touch with. And so I kind of, again, I wouldn't have probably used this language at the time, but I really embraced those kind of non-duality leanings that I had from elementary school. And I have to tell you, from that experience onward, not to say I had a perfect life with no concerns of any sort, but that weight of like the world and the system and the man and the conspiracy and the aliens or whatever that amounted to, it lifted. It lifted basically within the following day. It was palpable and it was permanent. I've never had those concerns again. And frankly, given 4 to 5 years later, I was starting to like work with the 3-letter agencies that used to freak me out. I never would have been able to do that without having that weight lifted. And not to say I'm like, accepting of any horrible things that are done in the name of America or whatever. I mean, I'm very realistic. However, the weight was gone. I could literally breathe easier. That kind of generalized. I wasn't like a paranoid person, but like the sense of paranoia that, again, I think many people reasonably have, especially these days. I was just like, oh, that doesn't bother me anymore. There's something, it took me a few more years to really get to the core of what that comfort was and kind of more formally discovering non-dualism, and especially in ancient traditions around 2013 in the wake of a breakup, actually. And maybe that's the next plot point in this story.
Well, let's pause there because I want to analyze one thing that I think was
Sure.
important in your description of what happened. You said that, well, not a lot was communicated to you. And I think that I know that you're not the only person I've ever spoken to who's had a kind of experience of something outside the sphere of what we consider like, consensus or reality as we've understood it, but who's said that they felt a kind of disappointment that not much was said. But it sounds to me like the thing that you actually took away from it, that kind of inner realization or return to a kind of inner peace, is really valuable. And it's the sort of thing that if there had been an explicit message, if some alien, for instance, had come to you and just said a bunch of stuff that you had never heard or thought of before, it seems like that could only increase the sense of confusion and alienation from the world and that weight of the ickiness, no matter how benevolent it might have sounded, because here you've got this thing coming out and just like saying a bunch of stuff to you, and you don't have any way of determining if it's true or not. It's might have made you feel special. It might have been exciting, but it would have fed that general view of the world that on which all that ickiness and weight and suspicion and alienation is predicated. But to come and to say nothing is sort of the only way to push you back into your own sort of internal ground and to find your center in the way that relieves it. So it's interesting to me that that's a pattern I've noticed in multiple people I've personally spoken to, where they said they've had a breakthrough experience with something that felt like a conscious entity, and it said absolutely nothing to them, but had a profound.
Well, and again, I'm not communicating every little component, but it wasn't this complex message or anything. It really was what I've distilled. In the wake of one of my favorite directors, David Lynch, passing recently, and strangely, I had been rewatching a lot of his stuff already. And then he passes, and I'm like, oh, I got to work my way through the rest. For some reason, I had not seen Mulholland Drive.
I'm sorry, have you seen it now?
Yes.
Yeah. I envy you. I envy you being able to watch Mulholland Drive for the first time.
It was great. I bought it on Apple, and I'm going to watch it a bunch more times. I won't give anything away, no spoilers.
It's hard to spoil that movie, but yeah.
There's this concept of this blue key that emerges, and then a blue box that it opens, and we could just say maybe a deeper level of truth within the context of that movie emerges when the key is turned and a whole new paradigm emerges. And in the course of the David Lynch movie, it's not necessarily a happy ending per se, but it's very highly symbolic of unlocking something in your mind. I have this notion, I worked with data, and so compression and compression algorithms and encoding data was like a big part of my career. And like, all I can say is it felt like a key was entered that decompressed a lot of like fractally compressed information that I already had available to me. And it was like, and it kind of emerged. And
it became readable or something. It became information that you could access in a way or had some meaning.
Yeah. And I mean, I was already like pretty aware of it. That's what I realized. It was not concepts that were totally new. It was going back to the deepest concepts that I had been pursuing that we've talked about today from my youth, and realizing that was the core of so much, and that when a certain thing unlocks, there's ultimate protection against absolutely anything, and it's just like kind of laughable. So proceeding, I had this breakup in 2013. I was, bad state. I was sad, typical stuff. Again, I had the ups and downs of a human life and emotional reactions to situations and things. And my mom recommended a couple of books. They were actually from Westerners, but they kind of get at non-dualism as a philosophy, kind of as enshrined in a number of traditions from around the world, but especially a number of Eastern traditions, including Advaita or non-dual Vedanta, Vedanta being kind of this philosophical basis of the Vedas and the core of the Hindu traditions, or at least a good number of the Hindu traditions. And I was like, well, that's interesting. And I'm going to kind of keep digging here and go to kind of more of the Indian saints and swamis. And I actually was introduced to Ramana Maharshi, who really was quite the saint. And again, he had this approach that he really, and not exclusively him, but he had a unique take on describing the self-inquiry process, and figuring out the answer to the question once and for all, who am I? Which answers all things as far as I'm concerned. And I was reading some Maharshi, I think it was in his pamphlet, Who Am I, which is a short thing. You can get it for free on the internet. Who Am I? Ramana Maharshi. Everyone should read it. And not to say you'll have like an enlightenment experience upon reading it, but it's food for thought. And that self-inquiry process is critical. And I think everyone should do it. And I read it and I was like, wait a minute, I thought I made this stuff up.
Yes,
Like,
that's a lovely experience of realizing that the thing that was inside you is a whole tradition.
it was a profound life experience. Everything made much more sense at that point.
It's very validating too, right? That this isn't just
maybe I'm not an alien. Like maybe there are other people who have put this together and come to the same. And look, he even did it by asking himself, who is this thing that is me? What is the meanness? I was like, oh my God, I was doing that in elementary school. Not to claim I am this or I am that or whatever, to the listeners here or watchers of this episode. It was just familiar to me and very comforting.
It's not a self-aggrandizing claim at all. It's actually the very inverse of it. It's saying that this thing is not just a me thing that I discovered. I didn't come up with this. This is a real process that you can go through, and there's a real result that you can yourself find, and you'll realize I didn't just.
And it's accessible to all.
Yes.
Like, one of the core of this teaching, and it's, I'll call it maybe a perversion of UFO world and a lot of the more amorphous or mystical thinking around it. Not to say that's completely invalid thinking, but in the ancient traditions, you weren't sitting there meditating all day long to go on astral adventures. You were sitting there meditating to figure out, who am I? You weren't doing it to be able to float in the air. You weren't doing it to talk to interdimensional beings or travel through time or, incorporate non-physically in some remote environment and interact with people or do remote viewing. Those were considered what the word is cities, and they're really like the yogi powers. And they are almost universally described as being distractions that really, if anything, pull you away from the thing that you need to focus on.
Exactly. Yeah, there's so many traditions in the Buddhist traditions too of meditations where the advice is once you get deep enough into your practice, you're going to notice all these things that you can do. Just don't worry about them. Don't mess with them. They're just going to distract you. You're going to encounter beings, but they're just suffering beings like you, and they're going to distract you.
It's just more stuff.
Yeah.
And the whole point is stripping away layers of stuff to get to the core of things, to get to the core of the self, and linking the lowercase s self and the uppercase s self. And like those other things actually, to me anyway, and I think a lot of people would agree, the reality that allows for those types of outlier experiences, maybe this even includes seeing UFOs or aliens or whatever, gets much more understandable inherently when that deeper framework has emerged for you. But if you don't have the deeper framework and all of that other stuff you start to engage with, it just confuses and in fact can terrorize. I mean, people might remember the penultimate stage before Buddha's enlightenment was encountering Mara, this notion of sort of the demon comes at you.
The Mara is the demon that's responsible for all of the illusion and perversion of reality. Yeah.
And I think there's like a lot of people going through, call it awakening or whatever you want, what word you want to put on it, who get like a little paused in that mode. In fact, I'd almost argue Gnosticism is getting stuck at that phase philosophically, because you're seeing the creation, you're seeing it like the manipulator. You haven't like realized who's holding the strings.
Yeah, there's a sense in which, if you just chart a lot of these kind of maps of spiritual progression offered by different traditions, we don't have to believe in any of them. There's a sense in which, and every one of them, the person is described as always thinking that they've reached the sort of final level or whatever, and not realizing there's another thing beyond this that you have to push through, right? And I say that as in a way identifying as a kind of Gnostic in my own spiritual walk, and but that's a big part of the Gnostic journey too, is realizing that sort of at every point you have a breakthrough and you think, finally, I found it, and you don't realize that no, you've got to go through. And this is something I find really interesting in relation to the UFO world too, because you have, of course, the nuts and bolts camp who just want to investigate things as far as we can by conceiving of them as technologies or advanced cars that can fly with like humans inside them or something. But then you have these other camps like CE5 people who want to call down UFOs from the sky, and it's really hard to understand what those camps have to do with each other, other than a kind of vague interest in things in the sky. But I kind of find a way of having a foot in both, because I'm certainly interested in the scientific aspects of the phenomenon, but I also have a conception of the world in which I think these psychological or psychic or spiritual activities are real and matter, and that there's something that they can be in contact with. And even though they may be distractions, there's you can get good at them, which is kind of strange. When you're describing these, if we go back and talk about the journey of enlightenment, or coming face to face with Mara and it being a distraction on the path of enlightenment or whatever, it's strange that these distractions are things that you can invest in and become like really, really good at them. You might be able to become really good at talking to other sorts of beings or calling things out of the sky or whatever, but they might still be ultimately a kind of, they're not the ultimate layer that you want to get to. They're not as substantial and ontologically final as they might seem. Does that make sense?
Well, it does. And, it's funny that there's any quote unquote nuts and bolts anyone when it relates to anything, considering quantum physics told us for the last 100 years what the nature of reality appears to be, which is not something we would think of as nuts and bolts.
Sure.
It's real. It's real. Experience is real. I'm having an experience right now. It's one of the reasons I don't love the term experiencer when talking about people who have had a particular type of experience, because we are the experiencer. That's kind of the answer to who am I at the end of the day. That'll mean nothing for someone who hasn't really considered it. But like, the experiencer is what's central. And so to say some people deserve that title because of a particular set of experiences they feel that they've had versus other people who are not experiencers, it doesn't sit well with me, because acknowledging the universalness of the experiencer as the base layer of reality is available to everyone, regardless of what type of experiences they've had. If you've had any experiences, you're the experiencer.
So let me see if I'm translating that right into a more general proposition. Are you saying that it's a mistake to confer kind of prestige on UAP experiencers, quote unquote, because it's not that particular kind of phenomena that really matters when the goal is to understand reality at a deeper level or something?
The fact that there is an experiencer is the most mystic thing that a person could ever come and touch and be aware of as that experiencer.
And so is all experience equally useful for this journey or goal of like coming into contact with or understanding reality at this?
Well, go back to meditation. Close your eyes, focus on the breath, learn to let thoughts and sensations subside. What's left? Like literally the first person perspective itself. We even call it the first person. You're the first person perspective. Consciousness, pure consciousness is the first person. And it's also the non-person that is like the whole sea of just pure awareness. But when we think about who we are and we truly interrogate it, we will realize that the color of any particular experience is essentially irrelevant. Strip it all away. Who am I? I am that which experiences and is aware of its experience to some degree. It's fascinating because we associate these with Eastern ideas, but that's not true. They're universal. And if you even think about Moses going up the mountain to get the 10 Commandments, where there's this glowing light emanating from the brush that's specifically described as not being a fire. I mean, the idea of a light source, an artificial light source at night coming from behind something, like we had fire to do that pretty much. So they called it a burning bush, but it was really an illuminated bush or tree or whatever, right? And then like Moses has this experience and gets the 10 Commandments. And then like he's about to go back to the Israelites or whatever. And he's like, who should I tell them I've been speaking with up here? And what's the answer? I am. I am. That I am.
I am. Yeah.
Tell them I am sent you. And what's interesting is Ramana Maharshi and many other Eastern mystics and sages and saints and monks and everything have said that that's the answer. Who am I? I am. So, you can say that was God and leave it all amorphous, or you could say he had an encounter with some kind of apparently non-human intelligence that itself identified with I amness.
Being itself. Yeah.
And conscious being.
Yes.
It's funny. I said this to someone the other day. We use the word being in English to describe the sort of objective state of being. And yet a being is that which has a subjective experience of being. We use the same word, exact same word, to describe both the subjective and objective aspect of being. There is being a being, and there is the experience of being. Maybe they're the same thing. Yes. That is non-duality in a nutshell, is that's really one. And like, here I am, and I'm talking to you, and you're talking to me, and like, you think you have a consciousness, and I think I have a consciousness. But could be that there's really only consciousness, and it measures itself from an infinite number of points of view. And so here we are thinking that you're the object and I'm the subject. And yet it's really all just one thing measuring itself and reflecting itself. And it's fascinating because this is kind of what quantum physics says. There's one system. It's self-measuring. I mean, even Schrodinger, who was kind of a scumbag in real life, it turns out, but he was still foundational in quantum physics. And he had discovered non-dual Vedanta and was like, this would kind of make it work, the whole quantum physics thing, if everything itself was the measurer of itself.
And this illustrates the point. This is not an exclusively like Eastern appealing thought either. Is that maybe the book that I would recommend the most for people who are into the physics aspect of it is Erwin Schrödinger's My View of the World, where he articulates this very sort of Vedantic vision, or like Martin Heidegger's Being in Time is an articulation of this exact idea that we've made a mistake of thinking that that objects as such and subjects are a distinct kind of thing.
It's amazing. You can read the earliest Upanishads from easily 600 to 800 BC, and that's really just when they were written down. And I think there's a lot of reason to think they existed as oral traditions for probably a long time before that. And it very clearly gets at this, as does kind of non-dual tantric Buddhism and Vajrayana, as does esoteric Buddhism from Eastern Asia, China and Japan. Certainly Taoism, gets at all of these same themes very, very directly. But so does Hermeticism, and so does Neoplatonism. And this is also kind of Plato's cave in a nutshell. I like it when people trot that out, but I'm like, haven't you people read the Upanishads? It's not just Plato who said this. This is like a very universal way of looking at the world. Especially amongst indigenous and ancient cultures that sprung from indigenous traditions. This is even like the Eleusinian mysteries in a sense. Like, this is a very, how could it not be common? If there's even a chance it's true, then it's universally accessible. And if it's really as internal as it is external, or if in fact the truth kind of balances the internal and external and creates an equal sign, then how could it not be kind of accessible by going within? Like,
it seems to be what people find whether they're a kid with a Walkman in the 1980s or 90s, or like a 90-year-old herder in the Himalayas or something, if you just leave people alone long enough and let them kind of let their minds settle like a snow globe that you haven't with it all, let everything settle. That seems to be the realization that kind of inevitably crops
You
forth.
can sit there next to Walden Pond or whatever and figure it out.
Yeah, with your mom doing your laundry. I just found this out. Thoreau's mom was doing his laundry for him while he was in Walden.
Praise mothers who give us the space to explore these things when they're doing our laundry. My mom also was doing my laundry, and it's probably why I'm such a clutterbug and don't clean anything. But so anyway, this has been a fantastic conversation. And again, I think it sets the stage because, I had kind of connected and then now more deeply pursued some of these Eastern traditions and other traditions that are kind of non-dual and found this deep resonance with. I found a community in Baltimore, a meditation community that's connected to the Giri lineage, who people may have heard of Paramahansa Yogananda. He wrote the book Autobiography of a Yogi. This was like Steve Jobs' favorite book. And, the Giri lineage that Yogananda was connected to, came to the United States and was really kind of some of the first folks who spread non-dual Indian philosophy to Americans in a way that they always wanted to make totally compatible with Christianity and kind of the belief systems of Americans and find a lot of unity there. So there just happens to be a limb of the lineage here in Baltimore. I did a search one day on Google for, Vedanta Baltimore, not thinking I would find anything. And this organization pops up. And I'm like, well, this looks like it's my cup of tea. And I started going and I was like, oh, these people are like it. So I found that community and got, doubled down on my meditation practice. I meditate about an hour a day across usually 2 sits and, doubled down on that practice almost 4 years ago now. And that was a very interesting process. And, just one more anecdote before I get to my the UFO, meat on the bones here. Another strange, again, I think, people who have outlier experiences or are philosophically inclined or whatever, maybe this sounds weird, but it's sort of part and parcel of living that life. I remember I had been at a major trade show for the media technology space in 2016. I was still with the systems integrator that I had been with for years at that point and stayed with for another few years. And we had learned that Prince had died on the last day of this National Association of Broadcasters show. And we were coming back to Baltimore from Vegas. And the following day was a Friday. We usually take that day off because we've been 24/7, for the whole conference. And, I'm sitting right here, I'm watching TV. And everything is Prince. I was like, okay, I knew Prince was big, but man, Prince is getting his attention here, after departing planet Earth. And I don't think I had even seen it before, but I was flipping through channels and I caught the end of what I found out I think was Purple Rain, the movie.
Yeah.
And there's this funny montage towards the end of the movie in maybe the last 5 minutes of the movie or something, where it's it flashes between a concert scene where Prince is doing his thing on stage and singing and dancing and playing guitar all at once, in a very alien kind of way that very few people were able to kind of get anywhere close to, and even performers. And then it's flashing between that and this kind of cheesy romance thing that's, I guess been a plot point to the movie. And again, I'm just catching the end of it. And I'm watching Prince just do this on stage, with his freaking platform shoes and his guitar and the athletic moves and singing. And I don't know what it was, but I had this thought. I was like, is the universe a quantum cellular automaton?
The normal thought that people have while watching Prince.
Obviously, what else would explain what I'm watching on my TV right now? And I decided to do a little internet searching for that. It just kind of came to me, and I was like, I'm gonna Google this. Okay, there's a few little things. Okay, I'm gonna go to Amazon, and I plugged it into Amazon, and this book pops up. It's a graphic novel. And it's called The Universe is Virtual by this guy named Alexander Marchand. And it has a cartoony Game Boy on the cover. And I read the description and it's pretty heady stuff. I'm like, this seems like it's up my alley. So I ordered it, and I think they even gave you like a PDF download of like the first, I don't know, 6, 8 pages of the graphic novel. And I'm like, this is explaining my entire like sense of things that I've been mulling over in comic book form since I was a little kid. And it turns out a lot of the thinking was stimulated by Tom Campbell, who, in addition to writing the book My Big Toe, or Theory of Everything, he was actually kind of the original technologist, I found out, who had been involved with the Monroe Institute. And it, like, that philosophy of Tom's anyway is sort of what emerged from his long-term, very deep involvement with all the things Bob Monroe and those folks were doing at the Monroe Institute. Now, I actually went to the Monroe Institute, gosh, probably been about 6, 7, 8 years now. Had a great time. Again, I had read about it as like maybe a 14, 15-year-old. I think I'd read like Bullman's book on it originally back in junior high or high school. It wasn't one of Bob Monroe's own books, but it was someone who had kind of been through Monroe. And, kind of gave me that sense of reality as the cyberspace construct in a sense, but there's like different servers you can tap into, so to speak. And I just found it really fascinating that like that same kind of philosophy of this kind of consciousness-based yet sort of quantum computational system is reality, and that's what this guy got from being involved with this and his own philosophizing and experiences. I thought that was interesting because like it's linking things that I've touched on, and I got that comic, and I really recommend it to people because it's a very kind of interesting, computational and quantum take on non-dualism presented in graphic novel, comic book form, really. And that was a really just because, again, I was like watching Prince and is the universe a quantum cellular automaton? And I was like, this all somehow just makes sense. Thank you, Prince.
There will be a link in the show description to that graphic novel, by the way.
I was like, was he an alien? And, when he left the planet, like his energy, like was permeating everything. And I just got that whiff of it that, drew me to that comic or whatever. But it was fascinating because it was just yet another sort of orthogonal, I don't want to call it a confirmation, but a reflection of ideas that had emerged in my own thinking over decades at that point. And again, being like, I'm really glad that this is all kind of illustrative of one point of view. And, that's interesting that other people have come to it and they've kind of intersected with some other areas of thinking that I myself have touched on, but it wasn't all like orchestrated or anything. Like people seem to come to this way of thinking about things when they go through a certain dance in the course of their reality.
I think it may be that any sufficiently complex like form of human life, whether it's music or computers or physics or whatever it is, once it gets sufficiently complex, you can use it as a kind of map or metaphor for this insight. And that's why we keep having these kind of moments of insight where we realize, oh, this whole other thing is kind of like you said, an orthogonal take on that same core insight that we can articulate, whether it's, I don't know, Prince's music or whatever.
Well, and it's fascinating, some physicists think that there's a holographic aspect to this nature of reality and this informational nature of reality. And, I look at this concept of Maya or the illusionary side of the world in ancient thinking. To me, that's just information. Maya is information. It's relative data points versus kind of the ultimate. It's not to say it's not real. It's just like the data that's contained in the hologram, so to speak.
It's real, but it's not the ultimate reality.
Correct.
It's a function of it in some sense.
It's, the old metaphor is there's the ocean and then there's the waves in the ocean, and the waves represent this informational interrelated structure, but like the ocean doing its waving is sort of the thing, not the particular state of any set of waves at a given moment, right? And, if everything is a hologram, it means that in this coaster right here is like all of reality is contained within it, right? And I mean, you get to the like physical reality that is this thing I think of as a coaster, and that's probably true, literally, right? If there was a truth that's contained within me and my brain and my psyche and whatever. Like, again, it's like, it's got to be in everything. Like, everything is that truth, you know?
There's a unity to reality, is all you're saying, is that, yeah, everything is equally part of that unified.
And it's not that they're all pieces. There really are no pieces.
Yes.
There are informational relative constructs, but there is just the one system doing the thing that it does, this waving. And it's fascinating because in Kashmir Shaivism, which is a particular non-dual school that emerged in northern India, Kashmir, obviously, around maybe 800 and then lasted several hundred years, is a very solid school. This is Abhinavagupta and kind of the consolidation of the tantric traditions. I mean, brilliant stuff. They have this notion of spanda, like the fundamental vibrational nature of reality. And it's fascinating because like a lot of those ancient texts sound like they're describing what quantum physics has revealed. And that waving, that kind of frequency-oriented way, and the relationship between waves is very key to that. But those are sort of waves that exist in the one unified conscious field that you could call Brahman or Shiva or any of these words that we throw on it. So yeah, I think that, like, if, and there are, like, as we said, Schrodinger and others, Henry Stapp is a really interesting one. He's got a really great essay called Minds and Values in the Quantum Universe. Maybe you can link to this because it is available online. He was a very highly regarded quantum physicist. I think he's still alive. He's in like his 90s or something. He studied with the greats. In that essay, he really talks about choice. And I think he's referring really to consciousness, and that, like, it's easy to look at quantum physics and its findings and say, oh, that doesn't resemble reality. And that's often usually sort of the narrative that's tied to it. Oh, like, we think of stuff and that's not stuff. But he argues against that. He actually says quantum physics confirms what we take for granted about our reality, in that choice and choosing what we measure and having that actually impact the system is how things work in our lives.
Yeah.
Some people want to remove free will and choice and everything. And that's not really what quantum physics says. Quantum physics says it might not be a open-ended MMORPG. It might be on rails to some degree, and you can kind of have a certain set of movements you can take. I can't manifest an apple in front of me right now, but I can think I want an apple and go downstairs and go to my refrigerator and get one. And that was rooted in a conscious decision, right? And then now I have an apple in front of me. So, our ability to manifest, as the term is sometimes used, is not unlimited necessarily. Yet everything around me is manifested right now by humans with ideas that emerged in consciousness. My room, my furniture, this computer, the data systems we're using, the buildings outside, like the placement of trees in my environment. It was all human decisions that led to them being there. Like, the vast majority of our reality, we have manifested from our conscious ideas that then emerge into this more tangible reality. And that kind of seems to be what's also happening at the smallest layers of things that we can interrogate. So I find that interesting. And again, it really brings together physics and religion. Like, and it's why I actually don't like the term spirituality. Like, if people want to use it, that's great. And it's like, we know what that connotes. But the reality is, it's either all spiritual or none of it is.
Sure.
The term itself, because it sort of bifurcates inherently between the spiritual and the non-spiritual, to me, that actually removes the spiritual realization from the mix. The spiritual realization is to find it in all.
In everything, yeah.
So why throw a label on it?
Different thing that we're doing, yeah.
No one's more spiritual than anyone else. Like, no thing is more spiritual, no practice. Like, us doing everything we do and everything in the world doing what it does and out into the cosmic reaches of space and everything is equally as spiritual.
So do you feel like when we're studying something like UAP that we're, for the people who are taking a kind of physics-oriented approach to it, it seems like you could advocate one of either of two different views. You could either advocate and say, well, yeah, just go and do it that way, the way you want it, because that's just as fundamentally spiritual as any other way. Or it seems like you could advocate and say, like, no, you're making a mistake by just defining it in these artificial bounded terms of it's just all particles and propulsion systems and whatever. Which of those two do you think is the?
I'm a non-dualist, so I'll let you
It's
guess
both?
the answer. It's both of these in a state of superposition. They're not two different things. And that's a really hard thing for people to get. Like, so in a sense, like, yes, you can say that interrogating the physics of it is sort of just as spiritual as everything else. I'm not saying that it's not. And nor am I saying a kind of new agey, and I'm as new agey as anyone who's been listening to this conversation this far is kind of probably getting on some level, right? I mean, I have my little crystals and stuff over there, but they're not two different things. And to give credence, I think, to how things work, even if you want to say that's just acknowledging what quantum physics seems to indicate to us, and that the role of the measurer slash observer slash witness is real. And in fact, the fundamental field might be that field of measurement that's constantly measuring itself, and sort of physics springs out of it like a quantum cellular automaton. You know, that is the mystic vision. like they came to quantum physics as the mystic vision, essentially, or at least I'll argue that. So I don't think they should be bifurcated. And maybe this is a good segue to my interesting experience sitting in this very seat, looking out of these same exact windows in 2020.
Tell me.
So this was, of course, as people have been hearing, decades after I was interested in UFOs, decades of straining my neck, looking up and just being that guy. Several years after this newly emerged interest in UAP from the end of 2017. So here I am, it's 2017. I'm sitting in the seat. I'm watching the flat screen TV against one wall right there in my room. And I had actually, this was, in the COVID environment, and the little meditation spiritual community, again, to use that word, but that community I'm with in Baltimore, the branch of the Geary lineage, we had still just been doing online Sunday services at that point, because we do come together on Sundays, and the Swami here in Baltimore, gives a talk, and we meditate together, etc. And I had done the online session, on Zoom, had my laptop on my lap. I think I was just messing around on the internet, messaging my mom and brother a little bit. It was probably, little afternoon, beautiful summer day. This was August 2nd, 2020. A nice sunny day. Normally I would, grab a little lunch after our service wrapped up, a little afternoon, and then probably take an afternoon walk. It's kind of what I was gearing up to do. I love my little walk here in Baltimore. I have the Space Telescope Science Institute that does all of both Hubble and now James Webb science, essentially, and they actually are the control center for James Webb, kind of mission control. And they used to be a client of mine back in the day. I worked in their public outreach office, did data storage for media and all that stuff. So, I normally would just take my little afternoon walk. But I somehow caught on my computer that the SpaceX Crew Dragon capsule was several hours from returning. Now, people might remember the Crew Dragon that launched with the two Space Dad astronauts a couple months earlier was the first commercial vessel that launched and took people to the space station, the ISS. And I had really tried to catch the launch. The original date ended up getting delayed due to weather, and I never caught them the day or two following when they launched them. So here I am, and I'm like, they're a few hours away. There's a stream going on. I'm like, I'm going to just delay my afternoon walk. I'm going to sit here. I'm going to throw the stream up on my Apple TV and have it going on my big TV. I'm going to mess around on my computer and, surf the web and chat with my brother and my mom a little bit. And it was a couple hours out. So I kind of had the stream up. It's a 65-inch TV, so I can kind of see it in my peripheral vision. And then I had my laptop going, and I think, just randomly, I have one of these little Baltimore row homes. It's like a connected block of houses. These are the tinier ones. So I've got 3 windows that overlook kind of the eastern Baltimore sky in Baltimore City. I'm not far from Johns Hopkins main campus, the Homewood campus here in North Baltimore. And so I see the sky. There's a parking lot across the street from my house, so it's kind of wider open. I see some buildings, but I get most of it's the sky. And, I got that kind of in my peripheral vision. I'm watching my TV and, peripherally, I'm kind of messing around and I'm like burning a couple hours basically. So a little over 2 hours goes by. They've gotten through, like they're about to come back, the capsule has, sprouted its 4 parachutes. They've switched from the airplane-based video camera feed to the ship-based one because it was coming down in the Gulf of Mexico. They were actually like chasing civilian boats that had sort of congregated, seeing that something was going on. They're like, you got to get out of here. A spacecraft is about to land in the Gulf of Mexico. We got to get these guys out of it, etc. So like, I had been watching for over 2 hours, Michael, and this was within the last minute before it hit the water. And understand, like the TV is like, the spacecraft is returning, everyone's excited. And let me tell you, in the sky of Baltimore, and I lived here at that point for, probably 12, 13 years. I'm 17 years now, and it's 4 or 5 years later. So I'd lived here for over a decade. I see every type of air traffic out of my windows on a daily basis that a person could imagine. I have many types of police helicopters, both local and county. I have medevac helicopters because there's a hospital a couple blocks from me, and they have medevacs landing on it pretty much every day. I have seen every manner of just kind of jetliner. In the real distance, I can see planes circling into Baltimore Washington International Airport. I get tons of just regular aircraft traffic of all types over my house a lot of the time. Stuff going over Baltimore, smaller jets, bigger jets. Years ago, there was a Navy project. I think it was associated with J-Lens that had these large balloons, like airships, giant blimps stationed out of like Aberdeen Proving Ground. When those were up, at least one of them I could see out of my windows in the distance. We even had a spy plane in Baltimore. They were using military-grade sensor technology to see if it could be used for law enforcement purposes. And this little prop plane.
I know this company, and
that's the same company you probably
constantly
heard about.
Taking one extremely high definition image of the city.
Correct, and it's like maybe a third of the city at once, and like a car is like a grain of rice. But if you know something occurred and that's the grain of rice, you can kind of follow where it goes. So they were, they didn't end up continuing the project. It was in a pilot phase, but like I had that thing flying over me. When I say I have had every type of air traffic flying out of these windows, I mean it. And I had also flown a helicopter a little bit, just purely for fun at one point. I did Robinson R-22 lessons. I got about 22, 23 hours in. I could fly the thing. We were auto-rotating, doing all sorts of fun stuff. Couldn't get my medical certificate because of a medication I'm on, so I kind of let it lapse. But, I just wanted to have that experience of learning to fly a helicopter, and I did it. So even one time, this is at the Frederick Municipal Airport towards Western Maryland, or at least in the westward direction from Baltimore, I was even flying the helicopter around once, and the Goodyear blimp was there at the airport.
Oh, wow.
And I was like close to it, right? Like flying in the air while it was kind of on the ground, tethered. So like, I'm very familiar with air traffic. I have been into aircraft and aeronautics since I was a little kid. And for probably almost as long as I've been into UFOs, I've been into like Black Project military aircraft and spy programs and SR-71, all of that stuff, right? So when I say like nothing out of my windows or generally when it comes to air traffic like confuses me at all, I mean it. Again, I'm the kid who was looking up for UFOs my entire life and never saw one. So here I am sitting here, last minute before the splashdown, the parachutes are up, the capsule is returning. Here comes the spacecraft. And out of my left eye, I'll try to make sure I'm in the microphone here, I see something in the window, my actual window, the one closest to the TV. So like I'm kind of looking at the TV, but I can kind of see the window out of my peripheral vision. That's like demanding my attention in a way like things don't, especially when I'm like for several hours have been, riveted watching the TV and like we're in the last minute of the thing I was waiting to see and I kind of want to take my walk. And something is in, the rightmost of the 3 windows. And there's something about it that's like getting my attention.
Nagging your mind. Yeah. You don't mean intentionally necessarily, but
So
Yeah,
I
okay.
am, I'm going to go out of my way to not try to make ultimate characterizations about this experience. Um, Feel free to ask me about my impressions. You might have your takeaway. Listeners might have their takeaways. You know, the funny thing is, I've studied UFOs for decades. I can kind of treat my experience like it was someone else's and simply just kind of analyze it, but both as the subject and objectively. But I have no ultimate takeaways. So it just simply served the purpose of distracting me in a way things in the window don't typically. And I had to make a quick split-second decision between keeping 100% of my focus on the TV to watch this thing I've been waiting over 2 hours for, and at least quickly figuring out why this thing in the window is bothering me. So I quickly sprung up, just walked 6 or 8 feet to the window, still kind of keeping an eye on the TV. I mean, we're talking the last minute before the thing hits the water. I look out the window and I see relatively close, I actually can hear a helicopter going over now. When I see Baltimore police helicopters or medevac helicopters, a lot of them are quite that one's right. I hear it right now. It's close. I can see it. It's probably, if I had to guess, a couple thousand feet away from my eyeballs right now, 2,000 to 3,000 feet. Very easily discernible as a helicopter, whatever, and some even aircraft, planes and stuff can be quite close to my house if they're making certain approaches to BWI or they're a smaller plane or whatever. So I get up, and at the distance of closer aircraft when I see them, if I had to guess, I'd say it was probably at most a few thousand feet from my eyeballs, probably 3,000 to 5,000 feet elevation tops, if I had to warrant a guess. Really no more than several thousand feet away from me. I mean, it was inside a mile, absolutely. I know, in fact, retroactively, I know how far aircraft are that look and resolve with both a certain level of clarity and a size, because I have Flight Radar 24. I'll tell that part of the story in a moment. I didn't have it at the time. But I can comfortably say this thing was several thousand feet away, especially towards the beginning of the sighting when it was closest. Very easy to make out. A very shiny, reflectively shiny, silver ellipsoid, maybe about these dimensions for people who are watching this on YouTube.
It's 7x1-ish.
Lenticular, but definitely could have been a disc seen from the side. It could have also been what's technically referred to as an ellipsoid of rotation, but that's kind of what a disc looks like when you look at it from the side. I couldn't make out a bulge per se, yet the whole time I saw it from one portion of the body, really about the upper right-hand quadrant, but not quite on the edge of this ellipsoid. It was kind of in the body a little bit. Maybe where a bulge from more of a disc type of projection, the top of that, possibly. But there is this dancing, irregularly glimmering, very bright, to the point it almost feels like it's flashing glint coming off of this thing. And what was funny about it, this glimmering glint that was pronounced, was that for probably the first 10, 15, 20 seconds I'm looking at this thing, I'm is that a reflection of the sun, or is it making that light? Focused on that factor, and then kind of being what the hell am I looking at? And the TV is saying things about the spacecraft returning. And I'm watching this thing, and after probably 15 seconds, I'm this has got to be what those UFO people are talking about, because this just looks like a UFO. And it's doing this really weird glinty thing, but not an on-off, this glimmering glint, unlike anything off of an aircraft or anything I've seen in the air ever. And the only thing I can make out about this is it's this super shiny metallic, maybe disc from the side or ellipsoid type object doing this really weird light thing. And it kind of, at aircraft speed, because I probably only saw this thing in total for about a minute. like the last minute of the SpaceX Crew Dragon landing and the TV sort of giving an appropriate narration for the UFO sighting that was happening.
That's what I was kind of wondering if you think of it.
And I was very aware of the synchronicity. I was like, I can't believe after this many decades, this is the minute of my life. A freaking UFO shows up outside of my window with like this tangentially related thing and narration coming from my TV. I had to look away from it a few times and return my gaze to it to make sure it was still there. I mean, it was tangible. It just looked like something in the air, like an object. There was nothing hazy about it. You know, it's funny. We talk, going back to the terminology and how poorly it serves us with these things. It's not that UFOs are, when people have the closer sightings, it's not that they're really unidentified. It's that they're unidentifiable.
Yeah.
Because they don't meet the typical categories. Like, okay, could it have slightly looked blimp-like? Yes, but it wasn't a blimp. Like it clearly wasn't. It probably was more like small airplane size, if I had to guess, the sort of typical 25 to 50 feet end to end, maybe. And again, I had a sense of how close it was because I know that aircraft I see that are that clear to make out, and I can see like the surface of their body, are only going to be a couple, 3,000 feet away probably. So this aircraft thing making this weird glint, it just kind of goes in a northeasterly direction. It doesn't do any jarry stuff. And the last I saw of it as it's heading to the northeast, like going to the mall or something, the last thing I saw was that glinting. It was still very obvious, this twinkling glint in the middle of the afternoon on a clear day. And that's when I was like, I don't think that could just be a reflection of the sun. It wouldn't be so pronounced from that far away at this point. I've never seen a glint so prominent and consistent in the middle of the day, both coming off of a portion of the body when I could actually make out the body, and then like continuing to do that twinkling glint as it's just a light source heading off to the northeast. So, I'll just throw this in. Take this however you want. Again, I just kind of spontaneously arrived at this. In the last few moments when I realized this thing was about to disappear, just off into the distance, I was like, what do I do? What do I do? Oh my God. I was like, I felt this urge. I was like, I'm just going to like put out a message. I see you, like mentally. Mm-hmm. And that's just what I felt compelled to do. I looked at it and I was like, I see you. I don't know why I thought to do that. I mean, obviously I'm familiar with UFOs and things and the synchronicities associated and the high strangeness. So I was like, might as well go for like putting out the call, right?
Yeah. What's it going to hurt?
So that was my UFO sighting. About probably a week and a half later, I've been mulling this thing over. The idea popped into my head. I was like, I've at least read, it might have been Zechariah Sitchin when I was in college or one of these things, but like something had elucidated that an ancient term for cosmic beings associated with the sky or something of that general class was the shining ones.
Sure, yeah.
And I was like, it just came to me. I was like, it's really interesting because the number one operative word I would use to describe the thing I saw was shiny. Its skin was a metallic, shiny surface, and this glint, it was like shining at me. In fact, I texted my mom about a minute after the sighting, and I have the text, I have the time code. I can confirm to the minute that this occurred. And I said, I think I just saw a UFO for real, because she was also watching the splashdown. She lives in Massachusetts. And I was texting. I said, I think I just saw a UFO out my window at the end of the splashdown, and it was flashing at me. And I just, again, a week and a half later, I was like, the shining ones. And what did it do? It was shiny at me is sort of the subjective experience I had. Then I think a few more days go by. I was thinking of a movie I really like, a science fiction movie, came out maybe about 7-8 years ago called UFO. Mm-hmm. It's got Gillian Anderson as a mathematics professor. Great movie. I really recommend it to people. In fact, dare I say, I think it sort of captures this phenomenon better than a lot of other works, because of the sort of nebulousness of it. And there's kind of the climax of the movie is, it's kind of like, it resonates with the experience I had and so many other people have described. I really recommend the watch. UFO with fun cast. Anyway, I was thinking about a plot line in that movie, which is that not that they pick up air traffic, radar data or anything, but like there had been some transmission from like the FAA and pilots associated with the sighting that takes place in this fictional movie that is loosely based on the Chicago O'Hare UFO sighting from the early 2000s.
I think, yeah.
So I was like, it just made me think. I was like, can you actually get a record of flight logs of things on the internet in 2020? And I might have had a slight recollection of this, but I looked and I was like, oh, ADSB, it's a thing. And I had remembered like hearing about it a few years earlier, but I guess I'd not paid attention to the fact that it was like a thing now and it had gone online and every aircraft is broadcasting or supposed to be broadcasting an ADSB kind of transmission signal. And there's a network of people who have receivers and they kind of aggregate all of the signals from around the country into these services like Flight Radar 24 and ADSB Exchange. And I knew the exact minute I saw this thing, because I could look up the exact moment of the landing and the splashdown of the SpaceX Crew Dragon, and I even had the message to my mom with the timestamp on it. I was like, I know the minute I saw this thing, and okay, let's even extend it out and put a few minutes of handles on either side.
A 5-minute gap or something that you can check.
I can go to Flight Radar 24, and guess what? Clearly, like nowhere near me, there was one flight way out in the distance that I know would have been a speck in the distance, and it was going in a different direction. It was heading more south versus northeast. There was nothing. Nothing. In fact, I've confirmed this with ADSB Exchange. I have the screen grabs from the several minutes around the sighting. There was nothing. There was no aircraft in the air broadcasting ADSB. ADSB Exchange picks up almost everything, including military flights. Flight Radar 24 often filters those out. There was nothing, even on ADSB Exchange. I actually looked that one up a little more recently than the Flight Radar I had originally looked at. So there's no aircraft in the air.
And just to be clear for listeners, you have to have a transponder on your, if you have an aircraft of any sort in order to fly, like to comply with FAA regulations.
Yeah, now in today's climate, small drones have a different identification system that is not ADSB, does not use those types of transponders, and but this wasn't a drone. This was no drone. It was no drone. So there was no aircraft in the area in the exact time, in the exact location. I was clearly seeing this aircraft in the air, aircraft, quote unquote.
Whatever it is, yeah.
Some months later, I decided to look up, again, because I can kind of investigate this as a UFO researcher, right? I wasn't yet involved with UAP science projects like the year I was with Galileo and having been with SCU for a few years now as a Galileo refugee. But I still was very familiar with kind of like the protocols of researching UFO sightings. Most of these things are misidentifications. I saw what I saw quite clearly. It's like that James Fox movie, I Know What I Saw. Like I clearly saw the thing I saw. There was no confusion of it wasn't an airplane. It had no wings and fuselage and coloring. It was a shiny silver, discoid or ellipsoid looking thing that basically matches the descriptions of a lot of UFOs that people have reported over the years with this weird light effect at a synchronistic moment, whatever. But I wanted to look up the wind speed just to like rule out, it's a balloon or a blimp or something like that. And I found, the day wind speeds for Baltimore, Maryland, with like hourly level granularity. And while the wind was actually blowing in a northeasterly direction at that time, it was like 7-8 miles an hour or something. This thing was like absolutely going fast automobile, or frankly, probably more like aircraft speed, because it went from like out to the distance in a minute.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's not something going 7 or 8 miles an hour. I can run 7 miles an hour, for a very brief time.
Yeah.
I couldn't run out to the horizon in a minute, right? Like, so this thing is clearly going like helicopter aircraft speed. So it's not something that's purely being blown by the wind, whatever it was. So that was what I saw on that day.
Let me ask you some questions about it just to get like some the bare bones descriptors down. You said that it had a skin that seemed metallic. Did it have any surface features or anything?
Not that I could make out, other than that glinting coming from a particular portion. Now, this starts to get a little vaguer in my memory. There probably was, because I was looking for a bulge. I was also trying to figure out if this thing was a disc, because it kind of, for a while in my head, I was like, I had a daylight disc sighting. That's a category some people have heard of, the daylight disc. And this felt like it met that general descriptor. But even when I was watching it, because it was so shiny, the actual morphology was somewhat vague. Like, here's a question. If you were taking a UFO report of that incident, would that be an ellipsoid? Would that be lenticular? Would that be a disc? Would that be a cylinder? Like, there's so many individual words that are sometimes treated as separate categories, but they all actually could be describing the same shape.
Sure.
So
yeah.
I was looking to see if I could resolve it to be a disc, and it was like shiny enough, and like there probably was darker on the bottom, which probably could have well been the difference between how the sky was reflecting off of the top and the ground and buildings and everything was reflecting off of the bottom. And that's why I say, like, the glint sort of looks like about where you would picture a protruding edge, even if you couldn't make out the edge. Again, I can't say for sure that that's what it was. But there was no real features. And in fact, it was so featureless. That's part of what makes it so outlier, and B, it's like it makes it hard to know for sure what shape I was seeing, because it just looked like a shiny metallic object. I've seen a few purported, I can't vouch for them, UAP images that kind of remind me of this thing. There's one from this fellow Juanito Juan in Mexico, who takes all sorts of weird pictures of UFO looking things, and I cannot vouch for a single one of them. He has put many photos out. Jaime Maussan has promoted him, and Maussan's promoted a lot of things over the years, not all of which are very solid. But this guy does have, this Juanito Juan took one picture. I think there's actually 3 that came in series of something that looked very clear to how this thing looks in my mind's eye. For one who does a Google search on Juanito Juan, Mexico UFO, you'll probably find a picture of this one that just looks like a featureless ellipsoid or disc seen from the side. It's over kind of a building or a shack and some other stuff, and it's just kind of up there in the sky. And it really, that's what I feel it kind of came very close to looking like, and that was my impression of what it looked like. So, that's the weird thing about it. It was clearly flying under its own power, flying, floating, moving through the atmosphere, whatever word. It wasn't under flight of a sort that we would probably, I think, normally use that phrase to connote. But it wasn't bouncing. There was no sign that it was moving with the air current. It was like this large thing that seemed to be moving under its own power in a very consistent direction. So, no features that would indicate how it was capable of flying at aircraft speed and keeping a very set, it's really fun. This is so silly. So I have a camera set up. I don't use it nearly often enough. I have a bunch of cool lenses. Don't use them often enough. I was like, if one of these things comes back, I'm going to get it. So I have a tripod. I stood up my camera. I had it on like a gimbal. And I think it's like a 200 to 500 millimeter Nikon lens.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
And I had it set up in my window for weeks and weeks after I saw this thing. Because I was like, if something comes back, I'm going to get a clear picture of it. It never did. But one thing I did take a very clear picture of, surprisingly, was a Mylar balloon, like a typical party balloon. It was probably about the same distance as this thing. It was much smaller. It was absolutely bouncing around. And I took a series of photos with it with my camera. It's general, I mean, I think there was a cloudy background. One of them was so clear, you could see the edge of the word like happy from happy birthday on it in my photo. It was upside down or whatever. But, and it's like this thing looked nothing like the Mylar balloon that I got a good picture of. The size was totally different. The way it moved in the air was very different. It was just like a totally different thing. And I ended up putting the camera away when I realized like the neighborhood folks thought I was a narc or something.
Yeah, they look up and they see a tripod just sitting
I was like, okay, this is
Yeah.
this is probably not a permanent situation. Whatever happened, it happened at a particular moment. And if that thing is ever going to happen again in my life, it's probably just going to show up in my vision and not when I'm waiting for it, so to speak, right?
So what do you make of let's think just briefly again with the physical descriptors. So you would say lenticular, some sort of disc-like object. If I gave you a lump of clay and said, mold it into your best guess, it would be something like just a very standard disc.
Well, it's funny. I got a couple of props to illustrate it.
Oh, do you have them?
I do. Let me take
Please.
2 seconds and I will grab them. So the first prop I got, I had Googled, I think I had looked up like shiny metallic ellipsoid or something.
Mm-hmm.
And what I found was this, and I'm not going to say it's an exact spitting image, but it comes pretty close. I don't know if you can see it.
Oh, yeah. It's sort of lozenge shape, I think is one of the terms that would...
Correct. And this one actually happens to be at the golden mean, the ratio of the height to the width. And what this is actually a top. It's really cool.
Like a spinning?
There's a very particular way you can spin it horizontally on the ground. And because of this strange principle, it will stand up and then start spinning in a very controlled fashion on its end. Now you have to get it the right torque. There's actually, let me see if I can still do it. Yeah, there it goes. There's a trick. Like if you know how to do it, you can do it pretty consistently. Yeah. And, I don't know if the aspect ratio is quite right on this one. More recently, I found one of these, and people are probably familiar with these. It's a type of magnet. They usually come in pairs.
Yeah, a sort of neodymium.
Yeah, and you can throw them in the air, and they come together and make this clacky noise. I mean, I remember having them around as kids or something. This one, so it's like if this was probably more like the color of this for the most part, but maybe the bottom was a little darker like this, and probably the aspect ratio was probably like right between these two things.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't even know if it had the same aspect ratio the whole time I saw it. Like when I saw it at first, it was closest. And maybe it might have like tilted a tad. I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm.
But I just want to say I'm not 100% sure it maintained the same aspect ratio of height to width the full time I saw it. But, if you're looking at these and you can kind of picture something in between, you can kind of picture like a darker on the bottom because it's reflecting the ground, but then picture like a very, very bright glinting light coming from the upper right quadrant. That's basically what I saw, and that's what lots of people see when they see UFOs.
So SCU did a meta-analysis report of UAP sightings, and the
great paper, by the way.
Very good paper.
Like it was so needed in the whole inquiry.
Yes, we have a whole episode where Robert Powell walks us through that paper. But one of the most interesting findings, I think, was the geometric sort of distribution of geometric forms that UAPs have. And when it comes to lenticular or ellipsoid UAP, it seems like there's two kind of clusters. There's the 1:3 ratio, and then there's like a 1:7 ratio. And those seem to be the two that things cluster into. So it sounds like you're saying yours was closer to that longer 1:7 kind of.
If I had to guess, I'd say it was maybe like a 1:4 ratio. Again, Again, that picture of Juanito Ones, whatever it represents or doesn't represent, it could be completely fake. It could be a total freaking UFO, or I don't know.
Sure.
However,
but it's close. Phenomenal.
Purely analyzing it from a visual impression standpoint, I remember it kind of being about like that.
Okay. Then the glinting thing seems to be not a feature, not like a physical feature of the thing or structural feature. You're not saying that there was a light attached to it. You just saw the glinting itself.
Correct. It was very bright. In my memory, it was mostly whitish. There's a small chance there was like a yellowish tinge to it. But like kind of the color you're mostly familiar with of a glint coming off of a metallic object, a shiny silver metallic object, or steel, like a polished steel. But I've never seen an aircraft glinting in such a way, so brightly. So, again, it was glimmering, so it was an irregular pattern, which, seemed to indicate some dynamic quality.
Mm-hmm.
I can't tell you what that dynamicism was, but there was some irregularness to some dynamic state that was leading to this very bright and obvious to discern yet irregular glinting affect, that there didn't seem to be a physical source of it on the body that I could in any way make out. Again, it really did look like a reflection of the sun. It just was so prominent and so almost, again, irregular but controlled almost. And again, I'm not saying it was, but it was sort of like the impression it gave, like it was like intentional. Is sort of how I would put it. It seemed like the flashing was not just a random response to the sun in a certain way.
Or to its movement. It wasn't moving in such a way that made it obvious that this glinting is somehow attached to the rotation or movement of the object.
Correct. And yet it could have been, and the thing was so featureless and so reflective, there's a chance that any either subtle or even fairly obvious movement when you have a shape of that sort, whether it's a disc rotating around, a center kind of axis, or if it was an ellipsoid and it was spinning around kind of the central axis of that, for a very shiny metallic object, you might not really see the movement of the object itself. You might see its movement through light effects that are reacting in a certain way.
Which is really all we see anyway, in anything is light effects. So yeah, it makes sense that if it...
So that's a possibility, but there's other possibilities as well. Could it have been a plasma effect, as some people talk about with UAP? And maybe there's some aspect of, how it's moving and the physical properties of that lead to certain, light effects that could be, plasmoid in nature. I don't know. It's not knowable, obviously, from my particular sighting. It's just, there's no final knowable truth about what that glint represented. But it didn't look like it was just making a light. There was some novel way this irregularly glimmering glint was being generated, either through the movement of the thing, maybe it generating this through some interesting physical property, or maybe these things coming together in a way that led to a legitimate reflection of the sun, because it was a sunny day, and there's a possibility there was a reflection. Being a reflection, but a reflection unlike something you would see off of a more typical aircraft.
Do you think that's what caught your attention? Is that...
Yeah, I imagine that there's a really decent chance. And just so people have a sense of the size of this thing, if I had to guess, I'd say the angular size of it at its closest was easily the size of the moon. Easily. And, I did a math using an online calculation tool I found, where you can kind of figure out, you have angular size, distance, and the actual size of the thing. And you can throw in, 2 of 3 variables and get the third out. So I played with the contours of what I thought were realistic for all 3 of those qualities. I played with the angular size being everything, I think, from between like half a moon up to about a moon in diameter. I played with, maybe probably 1,000 feet to 5,000 feet in distance. Probably played with, 20 to 75 feet in diameter. And I kind of like massaged these values. And they all kind of made sense in that I feel pretty comfortable saying, again, with sort of order of magnitude handles on it, this thing was probably in the, um, you know, 30 to 75 feet from end to end range, 1,500 to 3,500 feet away from me, like just a direct line between my eyeballs in this thing. And so it's like, yeah, it kind of seemed to fit the general contours of your typical UAP sighting from those set of variables as well. Like it was the sort of typical 50 feet end to end, plus or minus kind of object.
Did you find any other reports from that day?
No, I put in both a MUFON and a NUFORC report. Kind of regret the MUFON because I have come to realize that no one should put reports into MUFON. They do things like probably illegally make their data sets available to three-letter agencies that are really charged with monitoring foreign actors and not American citizens. We learned this through skinwalkers at the Pentagon and learning more about the OSAP program. Got to throw that out there. I get it that the government cares about UFOs and is willing to do some stuff to try to learn about it. It's funny. We think about like NSA gathering metadata and Snowden revealing, that we have backdoors and, social media websites and stuff. Like getting a hold of a UAP sighting database from an American aggregator of such things, it feels like that kind of thing at that scale, if not stranger. So anyway, I just throw that in as a caveat. I think people should use NUFORC or other organizations or SCU's own reporting tool. Put one into both. There were no others. It's a funny dynamic. I thought about it a lot, both kind of at the time or, immediately afterwards and in the years since. We have a lot of air traffic in Baltimore. There's always police helicopters going over. I see police helicopters and medevacs daily. In fact, a lot of the time, just as a Baltimore City resident, if you take a moment, especially if you've got a good view of the sky, you can scan from, all around you 360 and like generally see a helicopter flying around. Yeah. And sometimes those are very close, like over your head at several hundred feet is the case where I live. Not a horrible neighborhood, but certainly monitored by police helicopters quite closely. If I was more paranoid or still in that more paranoid stage, I'd probably think that they were watching me 24/7, but no, it's just typical Baltimore police helicopter activity. So a lot of people here, I think, tune it out. Mm-hmm. Like even if something metallic, and I don't remember a sound. Now there could have been a sound and I was watching TV, but like I hear aircraft. I don't remember any sound associated with the sighting that I felt was coming from this thing. So there's that. And so it wouldn't catch a lot of attention for someone who even normally isn't paying attention to aircraft going over their head. But if there was no sound and you have some vague sense of something, like people don't look up. They just really don't. I do. Yeah. Some people do, but a lot of people don't. So it could have been missed. And something weirder could have been going on. Again, I saw it travel for miles. Like by the time it was that glimmering speckle in the distance, it had traveled several miles at least. And, to think that no one would have seen it, like maybe they did, but who knows? There's NUFORC and MUFON. Who's even comfortable to talk about a sighting? Most people don't talk about their sightings.
Most people wouldn't have a clue what to do if they had seen one.
They don't share it with their family. They don't mention it to their friends. They think they're effing nuts. Like if that whole event had happened to me and I wasn't like a lifer UFO geek at that point, like a serious one who had studied this topic for decades at that point, I wouldn't have known that there was a MUFON and a NUFORC. I wouldn't have been able to even slightly normalize that experience. Mm-hmm. I actually pinched myself during the sighting at one point because, when you see something miraculous, who doesn't think to do the cartoon thing and pinch yourself, right? Mm-hmm. I was there. I felt it. Like, again, I have the text message to my mom, blah, blah, blah. But like, it's such an outlier experience that it feels dreamlike. Think about it. This was 1 minute at most of my life. There's a lot of 1 minutes crammed into a 40, at that point, early 40s life. I was like 42 or whatever. 1 minute. And all it is a memory and some external evidence, like the text message I sent my mom a minute later. And like I've told this story a bunch of times, including on some other podcasts, probably not in this level of depth and this level of analysis, certainly. However, this story has remained identical every single time I've told it because it's so easy to recall. And yet it was so outlier from anything else I've ever experienced looking in the sky. You could almost think it was like a fake memory if you didn't have very tangible evidence. If I wasn't telling my family about it immediately in the aftermath, I was talking to friends. I did put in the reports. I spoke to the MUFON case investigator. Again, I have the text message I sent my mom a minute or two after saying, I think I saw a UFO. It was flashing at me. But if I didn't have those things, what would I even think of this experience? Especially if I wasn't a UFO geek. I might start to think I had hallucinated it, or even it was just the whole event was a figment of my imagination. It was such a nebulous event. I can see how I have a feeling that it's probably 1% or less of UFO sightings are reported to anyone. That would be my guess, or roughly within a few percentage points.
My intuition is the same, that people just, when you don't have a way of processing it or cognizing it, you just kind of dump it into some corner of your mind and don't do anything.
And I mean, think about this. I'm a UFO geek. I'm now a researcher, now associated with Galileo. There's always, I always have that little, should I tell the story in this context or on a podcast or publicly or to this person? And I've done it enough now where I just go to the well, it's out there. I might as well do it again or go into more detail or whatever. But most people would not feel comfort with that. The hesitation would be where they land on, and they would not move beyond it. And they probably wouldn't tell a spouse.
Yeah, there's no incentive. What would you get out of it? What would anybody get out of it?
They'd think you're effing nuts most of the time. So
there's something I think particularly painful about telling a story like this to a person you care about, and their response just being, I don't know how to respond to this. I mean, even lovingly, okay, you've told me, and what do we do now? Okay, I guess.
Well, it's interesting. We started off and I talked about a family member who had some interesting experiences that sometimes are lumped into this stuff. And I think some others as well, just psychic phenomena and other weird stuff. The family that I was in, at least created a little bit of space. In fact, probably was about as welcoming an environment to share that kind of a thing. And there was still massive amounts of discomfort around that person's own experiences. Think about that. Almost the most welcoming scenario. I mean,
you could not have been
UFO books on the shelf, and and this person had a very hard time reconciling their experiences.
I think that one thing that really bothers me about the state of discourse about UFOs, UAP, and all the other weirdness out in the world is that first I find the concept of UAP so fuzzy and inverted and non-descriptive that annoys me just at a philosophical level. But the fact that annoys me even more and sort of scares me is that this really half-formed concept that we work with is the basis upon which a lot of people who've had life-changingly strange experiences say, okay, I can talk about this thing because we have this concept and there's a kind of discourse around it. But if you have a really weird experience that doesn't attach to that concept in a way, you feel totally excluded. And it's just so arbitrary that this one group of people, because it had to do with a shiny object in the sky as opposed to a voice out of the sky or something, one group can feel good about talking about it and the other group doesn't. And that's, I don't know how to get beyond that.
Well, I shared an interesting experience from about a half a lifetime ago with what, again, felt like an entity encounter in a sense that I think most people would put into the oh my God, I sort of feel like I had some connection to an alien type experience. I'm not going to characterize it in such a way. However, maybe it was that. I know someone who had entity encounters as a child. And, of the typical sort, as as these things are described in the UFO and contact literature or whatever. And again, I'm not going to try to characterize that as this type of experience or that or this type of being or it was literally true or whatever. Like, it's not my story. But they had that set of experiences somewhat consistently, and like it felt like that set of experiences, like they thought it was really happening, whatever that means.
I thought it was really aliens, you mean? That was their way of characterizing it?
Well, like this person was not even really comfortable going to that word, but just being like, yep. I was like, you mean like the,
yeah.
We're like, yep.
Oh no, we're talking about, yeah, okay.
And they later ended up speaking with siblings about it late in life as adults. And they had never talked about it before. And they all looked at each other. And it was just in one place that they grew up. And they said, that was happening to you too? The three of them. So, even just thinking about that, like my two siblings, like were in the same house, in the same place, having these intense experiences or interesting or very outlier experiences. And they didn't even get around to like speaking about it until adulthood with each other. So I think, this is, again, the term experiencer and kind of, a little bit of a wearing of it as a badge that some people do. And I want to talk about this a little more because it's concerning to me in some ways. I think these experiences are much more common than people realize. In fact, I wouldn't be shocked if many, if not most people, if they really go back and think about their whole life, yeah, it might have been 1 minute out of your entire life. But a lot of people have something that sticks out or multiple things that stick out as outlier experiences that don't quite match consensus day-to-day lived life. And we have a very difficult time compartmentalizing it. Yet it seems to be, if not common in its frequency, common to the human experience. Again, you can look at indigenous traditions, and I'm sorry, like, nuts and bolts people, let's go to that, who don't want to like look at this in broader sets of categorization or, knowledge bases or whatever. I'm sorry. Whether there is or is not a direct connection to certain traditions or religions or whatever, it's utterly impossible to avoid addressing the kind of archetypal similarities between UAP experiences, as Valet and many others have commented on, and this large body of human experience that seems to have happened for thousands of years somewhat consistently.
Absolutely. I gave a public dialogue that I did with Carl Sagan's son, Dorian Sagan, at Vassar College on UAP and the Gaia hypothesis. And we had this great conversation, but one of the students who asked questions during the Q&A section brought this question up of like, why are UAP, and it was a British student, he said, why are UAP such a American phenomenon? And that I liked that question, but the fact is that it seems like it might be, but it also seems that if it weren't, there are all of these other cultures that would have never conceived of it in the way that we do, right? They would have always conceived of it as a religious phenomenon or something. Like African tribal cultures have ancestral spirits that, as a whole category, they could attribute the things that we call UAPs to. They wouldn't technologize it in the same conceptual way that we do. So it's so much more difficult than
well, and people who make those claims are generally misinformed about the data set. This topic, as what we think of as the more contemporary UFO or UAP, set of phenomena, largely emerged in the public consciousness during World War II as the Foo Fighters.
Sure.
Those were largely being seen overseas.
All over Europe, yeah.
And Asia.
Japan, yeah, Japan had.
And by the Axis powers and a set of allied powers all over the world. Like, they seem to have emerged because suddenly we had radars and lots of things flying through the air. I mean, just obvious, right? Like, your domain expands radically into the atmosphere at a scale never experienced by humanity in recorded history, World War II and the air battles over the world. And we developed this amazing technology called radar that could tell us about things that are up there, that are metallic, that are reflecting these radar emissions. And suddenly we had a new set of instrumentation. I think of the germ thing as so analogous. I talk about this a lot. And We discovered microorganisms when we built microscopes because we needed a new tool in order to see them. So it makes sense that we start putting lots of things into the air and they have radars or whatever, and we start seeing these things. But they weren't American. They were seen all over, and they continue to be seen all over. They've been seen in Latin America and the Arctic and Asia and Africa, and you name them. And that's within the current set of phenomena over the last 75, 80 years. So, it does seem to be quite universal. And thus it makes sense that if these things were around a while, whatever they may be, that there would be a commonality to the experience of seeing them, just like there was a commonality to people getting sick from germs and it like being very peripherally in their awareness. It's some invisible force. Is it a demon? Is it the miasma? Whatever. But there was a universal set of people having the experience of coming into contact with microorganisms because they were ever present in our environment despite being invisible. And I really think of UAP as maybe just being a new stratum of the ecosystem and its inhabitants that a new set of observational approaches has made more clear to us. This is my hypothesis, of course. It's not only a hypothesis, and I think it's important for everyone in UFO world to focus on the difference between hypothesis, more confirmed theory, and belief. Mm. And these things have rough edges and overlap, but it's a hypothesis that I put forth. There's another layer of the ecosystem, whatever it entails. I say we have microorganisms, and then we named ourselves macroorganisms because we thought we were like the big ones.
Yeah.
So maybe there's another tier. It's the meta-organisms. And we're coming into contact with that layer of the ecosystem. I think we have to ask questions about what that implies about, again, these are all purely early stage hypotheses, but if we say that the ecosystem now includes this set of things, and there's a hypothesis that there's another type of organism in the midst, and it's this meta-organism that has broader domain and agency, at least on some levels compared to us, can we take an ecosystems-based approach and also generate hypotheses about how does that layer of organism in the larger ecosystem interact with the other layers of the ecosystem? We're not all
that
isolated.
Translate into that? It sounds like you're not quite suggesting an extraterrestrial hypothesis, but something that's equally present or that's been present at least here with us long enough that we should consider it an actual part of the ecosystem rather than an outside.
I'd say this. Extraterrestrial, for some of these things, maybe not all of them, it could be a descriptor of an aspect of the domain that's inhabited without actually getting and pinpointing what the things are.
Yeah, their nature. Yeah, they might be things that go to other planets, but that doesn't...
I'm not a land dweller, right? I'm a human being and I have these dynamics and the consciousness thing. To only think of me as a surface dweller of Earth that sometimes rides airplanes or whatever, isn't getting to the core of what I am. It's choosing one label potentially of many to fully wrap around that thing when we need to be thinking of them as hyperobjects. So when I say meta-organism, it could be that like microorganisms, some microorganisms are highly mobile and some are less mobile. Could be some meta-organisms are more mobile and some are less mobile. The whole paradigm of these things might be ETs or aliens visiting Earth. It's completely ridiculous. If something is interstellar, let's pick a label that kind of we're really meaning. There's something with an interstellar capability, or maybe even just interplanetary, if this thing is buried on Jupiter somewhere. But let's call it interstellar. If you are a thing that can operate at interstellar scales, Earth is just part of your domain. Are you intentionally visiting Earth, or is Earth just any the mall or whatever? It's in your domain. We might not want to think of these things and what they are and what they're capable of purely based on that mobility aspect. There could be many other aspects to explore beyond just how mobile they are. What the full range of the domain is. I used the like humans coming across an anthill on the savannah, for the first time. Like that anthill was always within the domain of those people. It's just like finally a person decided to come up to that one and brush against it or whatever. It's not an alien. It's not really from outside of that domain, but it has a much broader domain, and it just so happens to include that ant mound. So
And since we're the ones that have stepped outside of our domain and sort of brushed up against it, where it was
correct. So,
a new part.
I wouldn't be surprised, like it wouldn't blow my mind if some of these UFO things had some connection to a notion that we would think of as extraterrestrial or interstellar. But I think that's like focusing on the wrong thing, and to think of it as being mutually exclusive from crypto-terrestrial or time traveler or interdimensional entity or any of these things, whether or not they even have a meaning or not. It's like there's no need to make them mutually exclusive and pick. Like it's a hyperobject. It has many nodes and many edges. And some of those edges could be more localized. Some could be further afield. Some could be more oriented around mobility. Some could be more oriented around technology. Some could be more oriented around things that humans these days would consider more esoteric. It's like there's no shortage. We have to create an entire ontology that captures these things, and focusing on domain is like a node.
Sure. And so far, all of our schema for classifying things has been a product of the need to classify things that are already part of this domain that we've identified. We need to classify deer and frogs and salmon and things like that. And they're all sort of surface-bound creatures. And so once we start brushing up against something else, it becomes very confusing. But you're saying we don't need to stick with that system of classification and call this thing an alien or an extraterrestrial. We need to build out a new ontology of classification that includes a much more capacious view of what might be. So I guess I'm identifying not that you're an extraterrestrial hypothesis, but I'm identifying what you're not. Is you're not advocating this kind of Marvin the Martian view of extraterrestrials, where they're creatures that live on the surface of some other planet and they come here in fancier spaceships. You think that there might
Well, I mean, that's entirely possible.
Yeah, but that's not the limits of your of
correct.
What you limits.
And that very construct of I'm a thing, I'm biological, I kind of resemble humans, I have a piece of technology I can get in and go from point A to point B and maybe back to point A again. Like that just might not be a good way of describing interstellar intelligence that's capable of moving between star systems. Like, there's this notion of, maybe the Greys are like bio-robots or whatever. I mean, I would argue, well, I mean, aren't we just kind of bio-robots? Like if they're conscious or whatever, even have the observational quality, are they really any different than us at the end of the day? So there's that. And then really interesting questions that emerge about like, are we technology? Is DNA a technology? Is it a terraforming technology? There's so like technology we think of as like this laptop in front of me, this microphone that's recording my voice right now. But there's nothing, I worked for a DNA data storage and computing company. There's nothing that says molecules can't be technology.
Oh, sure. Language is technology.
Exactly.
Concepts are technology.
So, interstellar things, they might be, that, but it might be better to think of it as just a very broad domain that Earth happens to be in for some of them, and we are within their domain. And so sometimes there's points of intersection and sometimes there aren't. And sometimes they might stick around for longer, and sometimes they might be more coming and going. And the sticking around for longer, in cosmic terms, could be millions of years or if not longer.
Sure.
Or, a microorganism you deposit several billion years ago and just kind of see where it goes. Who knows? Especially with the Bennu asteroid stuff that's come out in the last months. I think this like at least accidental quasi, panspermia or sort of like, pre-panspermia or whatever is clearly on everyone's minds now in a way it wasn't even 6 months ago. So, there's this notion of the roadside picnic of like some extraterrestrial visiting Earth and like a little scrap of their sandwich proverbially falls off and like seeds Earth or whatever.
Yeah.
That all like seems not only entirely possible, they're actually saying they think we might have accidentally already put our microbes on Mars because it looks like some of the containment approaches we've used might not have been sufficient.
Or sterile or something.
So like we're already roadside picnicking in our own solar system at this point, probably. So there's so many possibilities, fitting it into a particular science fictional vision of how that would look, or very cartoonized, or like Marvin the Martian. But we might not want to say they're mutually exclusive either.
Sure.
And we might just, I think, be very smart to say, like, there's many different types of microorganisms, like whole different families of things that exist, fungi and, all the stuff. This could be very, very heterogeneous. Would probably be, if there's one thing that's intersecting with our reality in this way.
Probably lots.
Again, that's why I think of it as a stratum more than just a thing or even a family of things. It's like a whole new tier of how we see organisms, and it goes from 2 layers to 3 layers, essentially. And we may, like we have relationships with microorganisms. People say we have relationships with these things, or we seem to in certain ways, even just through our experiences, like the ones I've described. And, that would make sense if we're all connected in an ecosystem.
And there's nothing about cognition that suggests that if we did have really complex relationships with them, we would have to know it necessarily. We would have to pick up on it and sense it. I mean, we have very complex relationships with bacteria, and we don't have any conscious, awareness of it, at least not directly.
Well, but the funny thing is, and maybe this is a good way of landing this crazy UFO. The thing about the layers of the ecosystem that we know well is that they're very interconnected, and they involve all sorts of feedback loops. We're discovering the microbiome, and we're realizing all this whole sets of colonies of critters inside of us is integral to our evolution. Like, we would not exist without them. Life on Earth would be essentially non-existent without fungi breaking things down, yada, yada, yada. And we know that we can eat certain things that give certain types of microorganisms in our microbiome what they're looking for, and deprive certain other things of what they're looking for. And we can be an input to that set of feedback loops by making conscious decisions. Yet it's a little more complicated, because some of these colonies, it looks like, can kind of send stimuli and even maybe thinking, ideas, emotions back into the human organism that are their own inputs, that are like, we want more corn syrup, give us corn syrup, or give me broccoli or whatever. And so we do that, and it's affecting our thoughts, our emotions, everything. And it's like, there is no real up, there is no real down. There is a set of interconnected feedback loops that anything can kind of present a new input into that does radically affect us. It affects our thinking, our emotions, our cognition, our physical well-being. So we may want to think about the possibility that this other strata we're also connected to through a series of feedback loops. And, a lot of people feel that in the presence of something with much greater agency and domain than us, we'd be powerless against it. Again, it feeds that sort of fear and the weight of the whole thing, and a lot of, very negative thinking and cycles. If it's like microorganisms, we have a lot of power and agency ourselves to create inputs that might radically affect the relationship we have with this, amorphous thing. But we were always doing that with microorganisms, whether we knew it or not. And maybe we've been doing it with these things too, whether we're really cognizant of it or not. And frankly, I think it's why openness on the topic is so critical, because we may have more agency in those relationships, but you can't really claim it fully unless you know a little bit more about how it works.
And about how you work, and about what you are. I mean, that ties back to that initial...
And how we even think and feel about it.
Yeah. Man, this has been a fantastic conversation. Nick, let's end it here, because we've come full circle now to where we started, going through the consciousness and UAP and theories and your own experiences. I have really loved this conversation, man. Thank you for being here.
And I have as well. I really, really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you, and for you letting it go this long. It's been great.
Is there anything that you want to want me to drop in the show notes, or you want to tell people about that you're working on right now? I know that.
Well, again, I am just going to reiterate I think, a grounded approach to UAP that everyone is involved with, all of the stakeholders, all of the government folks, the spy folks, the DoD folks, the defense contractors, the new tech bros who wanted this, everyone. Like, we have to treat this sensibly. And I don't think that the truth of UFOs, I don't think that healthy set of inputs into the topic is to treat it as the only thing of importance. It's a connected thing that might be of great importance, but it doesn't mean it's the only thing in our lives that's of importance. I don't think the ultimate truth of the nature of reality is going to be found in UFOs. I don't think they're going to save us from ourselves in any way. We have all the energy technology we need to create clean energy on planet Earth. The reason we haven't implemented it is for very human reasons. I don't see throwing UFOs into the mix changing that. So I encourage people who are listening or watching to this to really engage in a grounded fashion. Whatever is going on in the state of America, even by the time this gets published, days away, it could be a very radically different situation. Please keep treating the UFO issue in a grounded, open-minded, but very discerning fashion. Continue to engage your reps in a sensible way. They can go to declassifyuap.org/action to get to the Action Center. I had a very professionally done video calling for people to engage on this and reach out to their elected officials. Please share it. You'll find it right on the landing page, and you can go to YouTube and find it under the Declassify UAP YouTube page. Please share it with your friends, your family, people who are interested in the topic, people who just, maybe need a little coaxing. But I genuinely think the most grounded we can be will lead to the best possible outcomes when it comes to more revelations and understanding about what this realm is. It's very rife for abuse by people who want to use UAP for their own ends and for other purposes that have nothing to do with it, or that tie UAP into very particular ideological perspectives. If we say that, maybe there are commonalities between religions and belief systems and this phenomena, I think we could say that maybe this isn't the first time people take that approach to it. And I don't know that that always leads to the best outcomes. So I think we just need to be so grounded and really balanced in this time, and not just kind of make the UFOs a reason to detach from our reality, but maybe to connect more with the reality that we find ourselves in.
Absolutely. And again, declassifyuap.org is where you'll send people to do that.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for being here, man. I would love to talk to you again sometime. And after you've watched Mulholland Drive again, send me an email and let me know what your thoughts are on it.
Absolutely. Okay. All right. Have a great evening, Michael.
You too, Nick. Thanks. The Anomalous Review is a project of the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. It's hosted and produced by me, Michael Glosson, and edited by Kelly Michelle. Our theme song was written and performed by Telma Crisanti. Communication and PR work is by Preston Dykes. Our advisory team includes Jennifer Roach, Robert Powell, Richard Hoffman, Joshua Pearson, and Larry Hancock. To find out more about SCU, check out explorescu.org.